Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Catherine Rogers Arthur, and I'm Director and Curator of Homewood Museum. I know I speak for all of us on staff in thanking you for being here today. We are truly gratified and overwhelmed by the tremendous response to today's program, which speaks to both its importance and to community interest. For those of you who don't know, Homewood was the 1801 country house of Charles and Harriet Carroll. It was built for summer's use, their winters spent in downtown Baltimore. Later owners of the property, the Wymans, eventually offered Homewood as a gift to the Johns Hopkins University, as the trustees sought to develop a suburban campus. The house lends both its name and its architectural style to the Homewood campus. The gift was made in 1902, but it wasn't until 1915 that Gilman Hall was opened. Homewood House served a variety of uses, as the first home of Gilman School, the Hopkins Club, housing for graduate students, brief use as a museum in the 1930s, and then for nearly 50 years as offices of the president and administration of the university. In the 1980s, through the generosity of alumnus Robert Graff Merrick, research and restoration began, and in fall of 1987, 27 and a half years ago, Homewood again opened as a museum and teaching lab for material culture. Over the past few years, we have expanded and refocused Homewood's interpretation to try to paint a clearer picture of the property as a working farm. This past fall, we planted an heirloom orchard in virtually its original location. On Friday, the sickle pear blossomed, and I was delighted upon walking up today to see that the apples have started blossoming today or yesterday. What has become painfully apparent, though, is the absence of the full story, the lives and labor of the slaves who made possible the opulent lifestyle enjoyed by the Carroll family who lived here. Though it has been ever present in our thoughts and considerations of Homewood, today marks the beginning of a more public conversation as we embark upon the journey of telling a more balanced and inclusive story. We are delighted to have you with us today and hope that this will be the first of many times we gather to explore together the past of this special place. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Ronald J. Daniels, the 14th president of the Johns Hopkins University.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Catherine. I've spent the weekend immersed in Hopkins history, beginning with a lecture by a Hopkins historian on the Hopkins that might have been, and ending here today at this important conversation on slavery in Baltimore and at Homewood. But of course, today's event is far from an ending. Rather, it's part of an ongoing conversation underway at Hopkins, and indeed in our nation as we wrestle with the essential questions of our formation. How did we come to be who we are? And how do we recognize and paint the full picture of our institutions? Today's symposium was catalyzed by a public history project designed to illuminate Homewood's past. As part of our Museums and Society program, Hopkins students researched and developed signage that would not only highlight Hopkins history, but also embed it more visibly in our landscape and our daily lives. One of those signs, in fact, is just outside of the east door of Remsen Hall on the way to the Homewood Museum, and it details the fact that Charles Carroll Jr., original owner of the land on which Hopkins now sits, owned slaves. Further, it explains at least one of the buildings in which the slaves may have lived remained on the land and was used by the university for various purposes until being demolished in 2002. What we know at this stage is our university does not appear to have the same entrenched and entangled history and relationship with slavery as many older universities that were founded before the Civil War. Indeed, our original benefactor, Johns Hopkins, saw his own life trajectory shift after his family emancipated its slaves, and he was called home from school to work the land once the slaves were liberated. There's still much to be learned about the connections this university might have had to slavery in its early days. And Baltimore's own history of race is obviously challenged and complicated. We know, too, that though our ties to slavery may be less direct than many other institutions, that does not exonerate us from having to reckon with the insidious legacy of slavery and racial inequality that continues to reverberate in our present society. And yet, we are a university born of the ashes of the Civil War, established as the embodiment of the research ideal to bring benefit to society, and committed to open debate and discourse. Today, we continue to be fueled by those core values, and we take seriously the role of universities like ours to engage the difficult questions of the day and to convene critical, hard discussions that allow us to understand our past in full measure and in a way that can inform our future. It's in that spirit that we gather this afternoon and that we will continue the discussions in new venues, including our Provost Speaker Series, starting this month called JHU Forums on Race in America. I am deeply, deeply appreciative of everyone who has brought this day to fruition, especially our Diversity Leadership Council, which helps support this event through a Diversity Innovation Grant. I also want to thank our Black Faculty and Staff Association, our Black Student Union, and the Office of Multicultural Affairs and our Department of History, the Museums and Societies program, and Hopkins Retrospective, all of whom offered guidance and support for this event. And finally, of course, thanks to Catherine Rogers Arthur and the staff of Homewood House Museum, who embraced this opportunity to extend their mission to educate and challenge us all to think critically and expansively about our history. So I want to thank you all for being here for what I'm sure will be a productive and meaningful conversation. I do want to apologize in advance. After about an hour, I have to leave to go to another event, but feel very lucky at least to be here to open this event and to stay for the first part of the discussion. With that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Dr. Katrina McDonald, a sociologist and scholar whose work has focused on explicating how life is lived at the margin of societies for disadvantaged race, gender, and class groups. In addition to her research and teaching, Katrina served as our university as Associate Dean of Multicultural Affairs from 2008 to 2010. And I want to ask her to take to the podium and to also ask all of you to join me in welcoming her to share her perspectives this afternoon. Again, thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. It is with great pleasure and excitement that I also greet you today as we enter into an extraordinary historical learning experience, a peculiar social historical institution, and a special family, the Carrolls, whose presence on this land will be indelibly marked, and has been, obviously. In being asked to participate in today's program, there were two thoughts that came immediately to mind and that I shared with the museum committee as we met. One was that about 18 years ago, soon after I arrived here at Hopkins, fresh from graduate school, I too became intrigued by the rich history of the Homewood campus and the slave inhabitants that predated its founding. This led me to developing a brief article on the very terrain we are covering here today. I was told, however, that if I ever published that piece, I would never get academic tenure. The underlying assumption was sort of clear, and I was young and new to the profession of academia, so I decided to take their advice and move on to something else for the moment. Indeed, I did, and yes, I was awarded tenure in 2006. But far more importantly, today marks a new era here at Hopkins, a new moment where we clearly have come together to openly and freely embrace this very valuable history of Homewood. And I have a show and tell that I hope I will not ruin. So the other thought I had as I thought about today had to deal with my own biological family. Though I never knew my grandfather in this picture in the center, the Reverend W.O. Bell, he is a towering figure in my family. He's best known for his preaching, and he could preach, and his civil rights work in Texas during the early 1900s. I never had the chance to meet him because he died when my own mother was only 3 years old. You see, let's get this clear. He married my grandmother when she was about 27. He was near 60. I'm told that her best friend was his daughter. We won't go into that today. Florestine Bell, my grandmother, died in 2004 at 100 years old. So do the math, and what you'll find is that my grandfather was in fact what? He was born in slavery. Right? So the second of these photos, the first photo you saw was him with his first 5 biological children. He had 20. And my mother was the baby and hated it. And my poor mother just died about a year and a half ago. The second of these photos shows him on a South Carolina plantation with his nuclear family. And his mother on the end looks exactly like my mother. And these are his siblings and his father. So I used to see this picture as a child and didn't really know what to make of it, but I did in fact learn that this picture was taken on the plantation. So he was born in slavery and got to experience freedom. I tell this story frequently to my students who believe that slavery is something out of the Dark Ages or something at least like 1,000 years ago. And I say, no, 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 it's much more close up than that. And many just don't realize that we talk about it often in a way that sounds like it's such a distant past, but its past is past, but it's still very personal for many of us African Americans. And for us all, this history is rich and full of significant revelations. And today is an opportunity to view from the purview of Baltimore, the Carroll family, the Homewood property, and the African and African American people that were enslaved and used for the purpose of supporting the success of the Carroll family. And to guide us through this journey are 3 exquisite historians, each with his and her own insights and knowledge. They be Drs. Morgan and Whitehead and Ms. Schreiber, who will spend this afternoon enlightening us on the subject of the Carrolls, again, their property. And later on, you'll have a chance to ask questions and to encourage additional dialogue. And you know, as these things go, we might, intend to do an hour of questions, we may do 15. It just depends on how we all manage our time. But I know however much time we have and whatever is shared is going to be extremely valuable. So we shall begin. And I'd like to draw your attention to the schedule primarily, that the break at 3 will still happen, I assume. There will be a brief break for you to stretch and get some water at 3. We're to wrap up at 5, so after the last presenter, I'll come back up and I'll be happy to work the floor with you in getting a chance for any of you to come forward and ask questions. And we still want them to use mics at that point, is that true? We want them to come forward. Is there a mic designated?
There is. It's not one of these.
It isn't one of these. So you'll see the mic at the time. Please use it so we can all hear you. And please enjoy, and thank you for your time today. Our first presenter is Karsonya Wise Whitehead, known to many as Kaye, which I happen to love because my nickname is Kaye too. We learned that recently. Dr. Whitehead is the assistant professor of the Department of Communication at Loyola of Maryland, right up the street, a partner to us all here. I would love to spend all afternoon telling you about this woman, but it would take up all our time. She has just the most remarkable vita. Her first book is entitled Sparking the Genius, the Carter G. Woodson Lecture, and that was published in 2004. She has a second book, Notes from a Colored Girl, The Civil War Pocket Diaries of Emily Frances Davis. That was published in 2004. And it was recently awarded the Letitia Woods Brown Book Award for the best edited book in African American history from the Association of Black Women Historians, which is really something to receive. And her third book, Letters to My Black Sons, Raising Boys in a Post-Racial America, published in 2015. Again, there's much more to honor, but I cannot not mention that she was selected to moderate the White House's Black History Month panel, co-sponsored by President Obama and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And she was also awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Progressive National Baptist Convention, selected as one of the top 25 women professors in Maryland by Online Schools Maryland, and in 2013 she also received the Loyola Faculty Award for Excellence in Engaged Scholarship, and she just got back like 2 minutes ago from receiving yet another wonderful book award that you can talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here today. This is one of my favorite topics, and it's part of the research that I do. The book that Katrina was talking about, Kaye, Notes from a Colored Girl, The Civil War Pocket Diaries of Emily Frances Davis, looks at the life of a free black woman in Philadelphia and looks at her diaries that she kept from 1863 to 1865. I see some familiar faces out here who've been there when I've talked about it, who are waving now, but it did just win yesterday the Darlene Clark Hine Award for the best book in African American women and gender history. Thank you. And it was actually published last year in 2014. So my talk today is about the ways in which we discuss issues of slavery, public memory, social history, and remembered stories, with the idea that I'm going to give kind of a broad contextualization of the ways in which we understand American enslavement. And then as we go through the day, we will kind of get more narrow with each speaker until we finally get to Abby at the end talking about Homewood. How do you remember your stories? How do you remember what happened in your life? I had a story that I used to tell all the time about this red wagon, and how I had a red wagon that I dragged around, and that my siblings wanted my red wagon. I had to keep the wagon to myself. I hid the wagon at night, and every problem in my life, I traced back to this wagon. I said, if I did not have a red wagon, I'd probably be more self-confident, higher self-esteem. I would have gone to the moon by now if I didn't have this red wagon. So I gave this speech one day, and in the audience, my siblings were there, and afterwards they said, you know, we didn't even have a red wagon. The wagon was blue, it belonged to the neighbor, you hated the wagon, you never played with it. So that got me thinking about the ways in which we remember our stories. How did I take my neighbor's blue wagon that I hated and made it my own red wagon that solved every problem of my life? That's kind of the way we deal with American enslavement. We start making up stories to explain the past, whether or not those stories are rooted in things that happened or not. Like stories about enslaved people being docile and being happy to be enslaved, that they never wanted to be free, and if they just could have stayed that way today, life would be even better for us. These are stories that we make up to justify or sometimes accept the past. I'm going to talk about that today, and while I'm talking, I have a PowerPoint here that has both images of American enslavement as well as quotes to kind of contextualize it that I wanted to just show, so you'll kind of have two experiences at one time. You'll have my wonderful voice, but then you'll also have these slides that will also be made available on the Hopkins web server or website. We'll make sure that happens as well. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, there were approximately 4 million enslaved men, women, and children that experienced what we like to call a subtle shift towards freedom. We call it a subtle shift because if you are then free but you don't have money, you don't have property, you don't even own the clothes that you are wearing, you're not going to get 40 acres, you're not going to get a mule, and you're not going to get $50. It is a subtle shift towards freedom. They are typically discussed as a group. When we talk about American enslavement, other than what I call the Twin Towers, which of course is Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, you know, and the big statue of Frederick Douglass, we talk about the rest of them as a huge group, as this mass. Richard Henry Tawney talked about them and says they are seen and probed from different angles. They are an ambiguous mass. So from plantations to individual households, there were many that found ways to assert agency and to actively create what we call a culture of dissemblance, which means that there were a number of enslaved people who negotiated every day with the plantation owner about their life. They were not just docile and taking whatever was given towards them. There was a constant negotiation. The ways in which I help my students understand it, if you think of a plantation and there are, say, 60 enslaved people and one family with a father, a mother, and 2 young kids, how are they able to keep 60 people enslaved from sunup to sundown every single day of their life. There was negotiation that was taking place. There are only a handful of surviving primary sources that document the stories from the perspective of the enslaved. This photo here, of course, is if you've seen 12 Years a Slave, that is from that book. That's one of those primary sources that give us some insight into what was happening on the plantation. He had a very unique experience being a freeborn man, very disconnected from American enslavement, and then to have been drugged and kidnapped and taken on the other part of the Underground Railroad, right? Because we know the Underground Railroad went in two directions. Some went towards freedom, and some who were free were captured and taken back down to be enslaved. One other source, which is a major source, is from the Federal Writers Project, which in 1936, they sent student researchers and anthropologists and writers, including noted black anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston and historian Dorothy Sterling. They went down to 17 states, from Georgia to Florida, South Carolina, and Virginia, which had, some of the largest enslaved populations. And what they did is they interviewed formerly enslaved men and women. They were trying to capture their stories before they died. It was fascinating because here you had men and women who had been born enslaved and had experienced that subtle shift towards freedom, but now they were in their 80s and their 90s. And so we wrestle as historians with whether or not everything they said is something that you can believe. Think back to my Red Wagon story, when they would talk about things like, oh, but I had a good master. It was the guy down the street who was very dangerous. Oh, I loved my experience. If I could do it again, I would do it. What we found when we looked to understand that is that a number of formerly enslaved people, when they were being interviewed, if they were not being interviewed by Zora Neale Hurston, they were being interviewed by white men from the town. So a white man shows up at your house and he has questions about your experience. No, my master was really good. It was the guy down the street that did all kinds of things. So that's one thing that we find is problematic. The second thing is that the white historians took these interviews, went back, and they transcribed them. So how much information did they choose not to include? That's something that we have to think about. So we try to rely on these things, but they're not completely authentic. And then there's another way we have these stories, whether it's from Solomon Northup and Frederick Douglass, whether it's from the Writers Project, or whether it's from interviews. Harriet Tubman could not read or write, but we know her story today, because there were white people who were reporters who wrote her story down. So did she actually say half the things that they tell us that she said? Did she really say, I saved 300 people, and I would have saved 3,000 more if they had only known they were slaves? Did Sojourner Truth really say, ain't I a woman? Did she really take her blouse off in a room full of white men to look at her breast to prove that she was a woman? We don't know. We don't have their words. We have the reports about these stories. And then that fourth way that brings us here today is when we begin to study the history of places like where we sit, the history of places like Monticello. And we look at those documents and we begin to try to piece together the history. And really, it is a search and rescue mission. If you've ever played hide and go seek as a child, one of the most exciting parts to me was being found. I absolutely hated that feeling of I am out here by myself. I want to find the perfect place to hide, just not so good that I won't be found. Because I want someone to come and find me. It's the same kind of concept when we're studying American slavery. It is a search and rescue mission. We are piecing together the stories as we stand. And it is a long history. How far back can we actually go? And in going that far back, are we losing the truth of the story? In 1619, the first 20 Africans landed in Jamestown, either as indentured servants or captured Africans. There is some confusion about which one they were. What we do know, either as captured Africans or indentured servants, that was a watershed moment in the historical fabric of our nation. It was the beginning of what we call the African American experience. It is very fascinating because in 1620, the first African was born in America. This is material we can document. We have that material. So we understand that from 1620, we begin to build out from there. We also know that as America became more involved and more invested in slavery, the economic shift began to take place. Prior to that, we were a place, a nation, colonies, where it was cosmopolitan. You had indentured servants, you had people who had already had their freedom, free black community, you had Europeans moving through, and they were starting to have families together. It was, by all accounts, a very different community with the relationships between black and white people at that moment. In the latter half of the 18th century, as slavery and the slave trade were beginning to be outlawed in many northern cities, it was becoming increasingly more entrenched in the South. Ira Berlin said that was the moment when you start thinking about how do you move from being a nation with slaves to being a slave nation. Which means if you are a nation with slaves, it's one of the forms of the economy. If you are a slave nation, it is the main form of the economy. As we talk about that negotiation, it is important to think about how much money was tied to American enslavement. Hundreds of thousands of dollars that were being bought and sold on the backs of black people at this moment. This realization would change the world of black America, and in so many ways, the world of the American slave system forever. This dilemma here is how do you create and maintain a viable slave system within a free and independent nation? The answer was to create a system that dehumanized Africans, limited their rights, restricted their movement. From a psychological perspective, and I think a lot about this, what must it take for you to be able to hold someone as a slave? There was a song from the 60s where Gil Scott-Heron would say this in poetry, everybody wants a slave, nobody wants to be one. So this idea, what must it take from you to be able to imprison someone from a young child all the way until the person is too old to take care of themselves? You are, in a sense, their owner. The American slave system, as a result of this, was the most brutal and dehumanizing slave system that has ever existed. When we look at a comparison, the most dehumanizing, the most brutal system that ever existed. When that happened, it meant that if you were black and you were enslaved, you did not have rights. Now, this also extended to the free black community. In 1840, they extended the right to vote to 90% of the white men at that moment. Prior to that, if you wanted to vote as a white man, you had to have a certain amount of property. What was happening in Philadelphia as more black men, free black men, began to gather property and companies and money, they slowly took away this right to vote. One of the things that James Forten said, and James Forten, of course, was one of the richest black men in Philadelphia, and some would argue one of the richest men in America at that time. He said that when they opened the door to all white men the right to vote, they essentially closed the door to black people and to women. Very few men at that time talked about the rights of women. This precedence became a part of legislation. It's the way in which we lived our lives. It's the laws in which gained our country to move forward in the ways in which it did. Frederick Douglass, and you would think I planned it out, to get right here to this moment just when this quote comes up. But Frederick Douglass talked about this notion of exposing slavery, not to maintain it, not to continue it, not to just deconstruct it, not to talk about it. Frederick Douglass says we expose it so we can kill it. And the only way he argued that we can kill slavery is to kill it at its roots, which means it must be automatic, it must be immediate, and everybody has to benefit from that. When we look at the ways, kind of this nexus between African Americans, we have to go back to that first wave. And in my brief time I have left, I'd like to go through the waves and then talk about how do we connect this to our discussion today. The first wave began with the charter generation, which in so many ways marked that beginning that I talked about. Now, there is a book before the Mayflower, which argues that Africans were moving back and forth into the Americas long before 1619. We know that. Those of you who read that, you're shaking your head, waiting for me to say that. Yes, before the Mayflower. But when we talk about this very specific experience of being black and captured and enslaved in America, we have to start around this time period. In 1619, as I noted, that was 1 year before the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts. It was 246 years before the ratification of the 13th Amendment. When these first 20 Africans set foot in British North America at Jamestown in Virginia, it marked a moment. And although the European slave trade actually began in 1444, this first connection with the permanent American settlements marked the beginning of the triangular trade system. We start thinking about who brought what to the table. When you think of Europe and Africa and the Americas and how you connected, one of the main things, of course, Europe bought, the tools of the trade. Africa bought the land and the people. And when I talk about the land and the people, I'm very distinct because in order for the country, our nation, to survive, people had to work on the land. Now, I'm not a climatologist, but climatologists have looked and said that the climate in the places where the captured Africans were taken was similar to the areas in which they were taken from. So what they were growing here on the coast is similar to what they were growing at home. Think about rice. That's what we're talking about. When you talk about the land, understanding how the land works also helps you to understand how the country was built. There were approximately 40 million Africans who were forcibly taken from their homes in Africa and scattered throughout the Americas. This story, in so many ways, would never be fully documented, but over time it did define the categories of race and gender throughout the Americas. It would take almost 45 years until 1661 before the Southern colonies' plantation-driven economy began to legalize slavery and transform itself into the slave nation. Because if you work for 7 years and then you're free, what happens? Who steps into your place? That's when slavery began to change. And at that time, if you were a black person on an indentured contract, you were then taken off of that contract and enslaved forever. When we talk about this idea about being enslaved from the womb to the grave, it was in 1662, 1 year after legalizing slavery, that Virginia's House of Burgesses went one step beyond that. Prior to that, your property rights would come from your father. We understand that that's the way it's in Europe. If your father's a king and you're a male, firstborn male, there's a good chance you're going to be the king. They changed the property rights. What they did is they uniquely conjoined a black woman's womb with capital accumulation by giving the white plantation owners, in the words of Angela Davis, an incontestable right of access to a black woman's body, which meant you received your legal status from your mother. So if your mother was enslaved, then by right, from the womb, so were you. There's documentation that talks about young white boys in the South when they talk about what they want to do when they grow up. There's documentation that when they grow up, I want to get a slave and start to build my income. That was how you built your money. And skin color became closely connected with social status and social conditions. At that point, it's what they said in the 60s. If you remember the report that talked about 2 worlds and 2 nations, one black and enslaved, one white and free. They talked about that in the 60s, talking about the ways in which black people lived in this experience, but we can take it back to here in 1662 and 1661. At that point, this color of your skin determined whether or not you had rights, whether or not you could move as a free person. The second wave was the plantation generation, which evolved as colonial America transformed itself into a slave society. This plantation generation was wholly dependent upon enslaved labor. And this took place during the 18th century. When you look around at the museums and you look at the places that were built, you have to understand that it was built with the hands and the body and the labor of black people who did not choose to be there. This is a job that they had. They were the invisible parts of the plantation, the ones that were not seen and not heard, but continued to work. Ira Berlin notes that this happened for 2 reasons. The enslaved populations actually contested the legalization of slavery at every opportunity, either through conspiracies, open rebellion, or running away. Second, enslaved people could not physically handle harsher working conditions and the diseased low country environments. When you think about the fear that enslaved Africans in Maryland would have if they heard the words, "You're going to be sold down south," those are harsher working conditions. There was a good chance that if you were someone who was defiant, if by chance you had let on that you could read, or even worse, if you were beautiful, there was a chance you would be sold down south. There was an active economy that was taking place for young mulatto girls. One of the documents where they talked to an enslaved woman, a formerly enslaved woman, she said, "One of the scariest moments of my life was when I had a daughter. My hope is that she would not be beautiful." Because in Louisiana, they were buying beautiful mulatto girls to work in the brothels. Third was a revolutionary generation, when some enslaved people sought and found ways to actively engage in the struggle to end slavery. And many southern and northern slaveholders chose to either manumit their slaves or allow them to purchase their freedom. This is what's interesting when you think of the places and the museums and these historic sites that we talk about. They had an opportunity to free people, and they chose not to. One recent example when we think about this is we think about Jefferson and Monticello. That's a very famous and recent example of the ways in which he negotiated with his own relationships and perhaps with his own children. This revolutionary spirit took place during the early part of the 19th century, and it moved across the North as a society with slaves began to slowly, according to Ira Berlin, transform itself into a free nation. This also marked the beginning of the Black Pioneer period. What is very interesting, throughout this entire time, there was always a debate about what to call the captured Africans. This is fascinating to me. In 1831, Black Americans were openly debating in the letters section of the Liberator newspaper about what to call themselves. I think that's fascinating for a number of reasons. That's the debate we still have today. So in 1831, letters were saying, should we call ourselves African Africans? Are we American Americans? Are we colored Americans? Are we Afrique Americans? And one gentleman even wrote, we should not be any name. We should just be individuals. That is fascinating. I shared that with my father, again, on this idea of my red wagon. My father said, I've given up deciding what I wanted to be called. He said, when I was born, I was colored. I grew up as a Negro. I became black when I got to college. Then I became an African American with Jesse Jackson. He said, I'm back to colored now. It's just easier to kind of go back to the beginning as I'm trying to figure out who I am. So the ways in which we understand these stories are important because they name us and they talk about the ways in which we understand ourselves. From the charter to the migration generations, race, class, and gender were shaped and defined as socially constructed categories. From Dred Scott to Plessy, there were laws in place to keep black people not just enslaved legally, but also emotionally, also physically, and in so many ways sexually. When you begin to break up the black family, you are, in a sense, controlling the ways in which people move in their own space. Darlene Clark Hine, in her book, A Shining Thread of Hope, she says that the slaves created and maintained a complicated system that was actually individualistic. They preferred to work out on the land. Because if you worked on the land at night, you went back to your own cabin and you can build your family. Whether you were growing your own garden, taking care of your children, in some cases running away to the forest to have an hour of church. That life, according to Darlene Clark Hine, was better than being at what we call these historic sites, where there was control over your person at all times. It's the idea of working in the house. Because when you work in the house, you are controlled, and you are at the control and beck and call of the plantation owner. If that's 3 o'clock in the morning and the plantation owner is thirsty, if that's 5 o'clock in the evening and the plantation owner wants a place to rest his feet, or if it's 4 o'clock in the morning and the plantation owner wants to have sexual relations, rape incest, miscegenation, were all taking place. So as we begin to think about this history and this social progress, we think about what Frederick Douglass said in 1880. He said, "Let us then, wherever we are, whether at the North or at the South, struggle in the belief that there is a better day coming. We can tell our own story, and we, by patience, industry, uprightness, and economy, must hasten that better day." So how does all of this history connect to where we are today? It is important to note that these are the places in which we have to rethink how this history is being told. We have a unique opportunity to connect these bigger stories to the museum sites where we spend our time. It is a dilemma to rethink this in a more comprehensive way, about the ways in which enslaved people contributed to and negotiated these environments. One recent example that I mentioned was how Monticello was forced in so many ways to include the story of Sally Hemings and her children. It is interesting because some of the pushback that they receive from visitors is they don't want to hear the slave story. Just tell me about the garden. Tell me about the food. Tell me about his work in France. I don't want to hear the negative. We talk about slavery too much. Why continue that? Why should we talk about it here? Why is it important to include this story? It is important, as we know, because there are some big lessons that we must learn. In order for us to fully appreciate this site, this place in which we stand, we have to research the full history. We have to be willing to do the difficult work, and we have to force the public to hear it even if they don't want to. It's like Plato's theory of the caves, right? You have to drag people into the light whether or not they want to go. Because if you don't, they will continue to see the fire on the wall, and they will assume that's reality. They will see these beautiful sites and assume that nobody built them. They will assume that mixed with the soil, it isn't the blood of people who were captured and enslaved and held without their permission. We have to help the public to understand that this is important. And we have to be committed to going much further along the path of understanding the lives and experiences of enslaved people and the plantation owners. The way in which I think is best summed up, since I am talking about stories, is a wonderful story that I just heard yesterday. It's about a buzzard. And I am not an animal lover, and I particularly don't like buzzards, but listen to this story. It connects so wonderfully to our discussion here. Paul Newman was in a movie, and there was a wonderful scene. It was a Western. And what they wanted him to walk up into this deserted Western town, pull out his gun, shoot it in the air, and all the buzzards would rise up and fly away. It was a beautifully conceived story. There was a problem, though, because when they pulled all the buzzards in the town, the director says, these don't look like good buzzards. These are not the buzzards that I imagine. They're not fat and robust. They look like they've been starving. We need new buzzards. So the director put a call in the newspaper asking for anyone who has buzzards to bring them so we can use them in a film. We need good-looking buzzards to make our story work. So that worked. They got the good-looking buzzards to make the story work. Well, then they encountered another problem. For some reason, if you put a buzzard on a tree branch, how do you make them stay? So they were wrestling with this because every time they put the buzzards on the tree branch, the buzzards flew away. And they said, this is not going to work. These buzzards are not trained. So they had a brilliant idea. Let us tie the legs of the buzzards to the tree branch. And we'll hold them there until it's time. Paul Newman will grab the gun, shoot out, we'll release the rope, and the buzzards will fly away. Well, just because they took away the capacity to fly didn't take away the desire to fly. Because they tied the buzzards to the tree branch, and the buzzards would flap around, flip over, and pass out. So they spent a majority of time trying to wake the buzzards up. They sent out a call saying, are there any buzzard doctors who could come and help us to keep the buzzards awake? And day after day, the shot never worked. The buzzards would flap, fall out, pass out. It didn't work. And finally one day, the buzzards were on the tree, and they stayed. And the director said, hallelujah, we have trained these buzzards to do exactly what we want them to do. They now stay in their place. Paul Newman comes out, he shoots the gun, none of the buzzards fly away. because they had trained the buzzards to think, if I try to fly away, I'm going to fall and pass out, and it's not going to work for me. So the buzzards refused to fly away. Then they put another call out. Are there any buzzard psychologists who could come and help us raise the self-esteem of the buzzards to get them ready to fly off again? Now, imagine this is thousands of dollars being lost every day. Training buzzards, tying them down, bringing in buzzard psychologists. And finally, a buzzard psychologist showed up. He said, I know exactly what to do. He said, the next time you pull the rope, I'm going to have a little electric shock. That's going to make them fly. So finally, this shot worked. So how does a buzzard flying away with Paul Newman's gun connect to our stories about why we're here today? Because we have been lulled into believing that the stories of slavery have to be beautiful. They have to be robust. They have to be full of people who are docile and like to sing. They have to be full of beautiful sites where nobody worked on the land and nobody was held without their permission. Places where rape didn't happen and incest and miscegenation. Places where black women did not have their bodies raped and used on a regular basis. Places where black people could not speak up. Good stories, good buzzards, happy and robust. And then we've been led to believe that you have to tie people down to keep them where they are. The idea that the slaves did not want to run away, they wanted to be here. One man by the name of John Field, who was interviewed at the age of 89, said, we wanted to run away. Our desire was to be free, but where could we go? The assumption is that there was a rope around their legs and that the slaves were flapping around and passing out rather than wanting to be free. So even when they were on places like where we stand, there was no desire to be free. The buzzards were well trained. And then we, of course, have to force people to understand that when that rope was removed, when that subtle shift towards freedom happened, buzzards don't fly away after you've trained them to pass out. So even though a number of enslaved people stayed where they were, it's because they had learned how to negotiate that land. They had learned that it's easier to be here than to attempt to be free. And then even more important, and I say this not as a buzzard psychologist, but I say this as a historian who understands how memory and sight and public memory is important, that in order for us to fully realize the story from the perspective of the buzzard, we have to understand that those that have the tools and those that win the war are the ones who write the history. The buzzard story will never be told. So it's places like this where we stand, we have to be committed to telling the buzzard story. Because if we don't tell it here, if we don't force the public to get it here, they will never get it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. You gave us so much to think about. You sure you're not a preacher? You're not a preacher. Okay, I just checking. That was fabulous. I have to say that something that you said really struck something in me about an experience I had about, probably 14 years ago, the whole idea of naming ourselves. Now, those of us in the community know this is a daily conversation, and what I always find amazing, people ask me, usually they're white, and they'll point to a black person and they'll say, what should I call him? And I say, don't ask me, because as soon as I tell you to call him African American, he's going to cuss me out, right? So it is today. But I remember I just recently took down placards off my wall in my office where I had in bright colors, African, Negro, colored, just what you did, right? Black American, Black, African American, all these labels that have shifted over the years. And at the St. Paul School here in Baltimore, I gave a talk to a huge audience of students, middle school and high school students, and I just walked around one by one with those placards. I started with one. I just said, don't say anything, just look at the words. And I did that for each one of those. And then I said, now, did the image in your mind shift? And they said, oh yeah. The Negro's very different than the Black. The Black American's totally different. You know, I said, oh my God. Right? So this just, again, helped to contextualize not only naming, but the context of those words are powerful and what it has meant to try to transform them, and I guess we'll keep trying. Thank you so much again. And now we have our second presenter, Dr. Philip Morgan from our own history department. Phil, when did you come to Hopkins? 2000? Okay. Because I certainly remember, I came in 94, and I remember my first meeting of this gentleman, and I thought he to be brilliant, I remember. And it's been a pleasure to be your colleague all these years. Philip Morgan is the Harry C. Black Professor of History in our department here, and he has quite a background, but he's extremely modest about it. So let me just say that he primarily does his work in the area of early American history, but he says he also has lots of other interests, which include the African American experience and the early Caribbean, as well as the study of the Atlantic world. He has a book dated 1998, which is entitled Slave Counterpoint, that you should all take time to see. I'd be here quite a while to list all of his prizes, but I will mention the most recent ones. He received the Malcolm Bell Jr. and Muriel Barrow Bell Award from the Georgia Historical Society. He has an award for his documenting, or rather it's the Documenting Georgia's History Award from the Georgia Archives. And there's the American Philosophical Society, which awarded him the Jacques Barzin Prize in 1999. The previous one was 2010, and we can keep going. This is a jewel of a man on our campus. We're very happy not only to have his savviness among us as faculty and in the student body, but his commitment to this subject matter. He's here today, Dr. Philip Morgan.
Good afternoon. So I'm proposing to speak on African Americans in the Chesapeake, 1700 to 1820, the long 18th century. Dominant slave society in North America was in this region, the Chesapeake region. At the beginning of the 18th century, about 2/3 of all the African Americans who lived in North America lived in this one region. Even though the proportion declined over the course of the 18th century, still by 1820, about a half of all the slaves in the United States lived in the Upper South. So when we're looking at the Chesapeake, we're looking at the center of the black experience, the center of black life in North America. It's also the central place in another sense, in the sense that, in sense of location, it's roughly equidistant from the northern and southerly settlements in North America, so it's central in that sense too. And settlement was dynamic, and population grew fast in this region as well. So just to give you a sense of location, this is the Chesapeake region in the early 18th century. As you can see, settlement and population, if you could look closely at the, So settlement is close to the bay in the early 18th century. So this is a Dutch map of the Chesapeake in 1736. As we can see, by the middle of the 18th century, settlement has moved inland into the interior, into the Piedmont, into the Shenandoah Valley. And if we went to 1820s, roughly, the county system is fairly established throughout Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. So we can see that the African-American experience in the Chesapeake is the majority experience. The center of gravity of black life is in this region. So what are the region's salient features, as I would summarize them for you from in terms of the black experience in the Chesapeake in the 18th century, long 18th century? The first, I'm going to give you 6 salient features as I see them. First is the role of Africa. So the African influx into the Chesapeake was certainly major. It added up to about 130,000 African captives brought to the Chesapeake region in this period. That's about here is the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade to the Americas, and you can see the vast majority of it is going to the Caribbean and to Brazil, but there is a thin stream that goes to the Chesapeake. As I say, about 130,000 Africans brought to the Chesapeake in the 18th century, late 17th, early 18th, into the 18th century. It's about 1% of all the Africans brought to the Americas. So in some ways, the Chesapeake is rather a marginal destination for the Atlantic slave trade, but still a major influx. What was the experience like? It's desperately horrific. I think this is the best image of what it was like to come on a transatlantic slaving vessel it's actually in the 19th century, but crammed below decks, separated from family and friends. This is the so-called infamous Middle Passage, a terrifying one-way journey. To the Chesapeake, it was a rather long trip too. It took about, on average, 70 days, about 10 weeks, and there was higher shipboard mortality on the Chesapeake segment of the trade than in other parts of the Americas. So about 20% of the Africans sent to the Chesapeake died on the Middle Passage itself. The African slave trade to the Chesapeake lasted about a century. It began in the 1670s in essence, and ended in the early 1770s. So if you put that into a New World perspective, it's much shorter than the experience, say, into Brazil or the Caribbean, which lasted many centuries. So it's a fairly short period. And furthermore, the peak of the Atlantic slave trade is in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And the Chesapeake's receiving almost no Africans in that period. So it ends, the slave trade to the Chesapeake ends in the early 1770s, and that's when the peak of the Atlantic slave trade is taking off. So the highest point of the Atlantic slave trade is the late 18th century to the early 19th century, and it's insignificant to the Chesapeake. Many of the slaves who came to the Chesapeake were from these regions here. So this is the 130,000 or so. If you divide them, where did they come from? So you can see that the largest majority came from Bight of Biafra, southeastern Nigeria, that is essentially. Around about 60,000 Africans landed in the Chesapeake from that one region. So, so at least there is one region that's giving a lot of slaves to the Chesapeake. So those people are going to have a fair amount in common. That region exported more women than men than is normal in the Atlantic slave trade. So the building blocks of family and cultural life were also present. We also know some Africans by portrait in this period. So this man, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, was from a Muslim slave trading family in the Senegambia region. So he's a prominent Fulbe. He's from the Kingdom of Futa Toro in the Senegambia region, and he's one of 39,000 Africans who came from the Senegambia region, the Upper Guinea region here. So he's one of those 39,000 who came to the Chesapeake in the 18th century. He's captured near the Gambia River. He's brought to Annapolis in 1731. We know the ship he came on, the Arabella. We know the merchants, the owners of that ship. We know the ship captain. We know that it left Africa with 169 slaves, and it arrived in Annapolis with 150 slaves, captured Africans. So that was 11% mortality in that one case, which was somewhat better than the average. He lived for a time on Kent Island, which some of you probably know, and eventually he made his way back to England, where he sat for his formal portrait that now graces the walls of the National Portrait Gallery in London. He went back to the Gambia River and returned to slave trading when he returned. Another figure we might point to as an African who spent some time in the Chesapeake is Olada Equiano. By his own account, he was an Igbo from the Bight of Biafra region, present-day southeastern Nigeria that I just mentioned. So he's from that region there. It's one of those 58,000 people. He was captured as a young boy, by his own account, about 9 years of age. He arrived in the York River, Virginia, via Barbados in June 1754. He didn't remain long in the Chesapeake, but he's one of the one of the many Africans who came from this one region in Africa. There's another formal portrait of him, possibly of him. He went on to be a famous anti-slavery advocate and wrote his own autobiography. And just to give you one other African who we have a portrait of, actually we have two portraits of, who came to the Chesapeake region. Here's a man, Yarrow Mammoet, brought on a slave ship, the Elijah. Like Diallo, he's also from the Senegambia region, also an educated Muslim. We know his owner, we know when he was bought, 1752. We know he came on a Liverpool-based ship. He would go on to gain his freedom, live in the Georgetown area, and live to a ripe old age. And he had a second portrait painted 3 years after the famous Charles Wilson Peale. So there are some rather rare examples of Africans that we know came to the Chesapeake region, and we know that there are all sorts of ways in which Africans brought various customs to the Chesapeake region. I'm going to mention a couple of examples. One I'm going to point to is head carrying, the practice of bearing objects and loads on the head. It's a custom learned in Africa, continued in North America. One Virginia manager was astonished, as he said, to see enslaved women running more than a mile with baskets of corn on their heads. And we have many verbal descriptions of head carrying in the Chesapeake, but I'm going to point you to 4 actual visual images we have. So here's a overmantle. Here's a picture that was part of a chimney mantle in White House Farm in Kent County in Maryland on the eastern shore, near Chestertown, as you can see. You can see Chestertown in the background there. You can see the College of Chestertown at the time, 1782, that was built. Then when actually it was then burned down and is no longer part of the campus, but they rebuilt it. And as you can see, there's that White House Farm that you can see in the larger picture. You can see slaves of various kinds. And I want you to focus on the 2 chimneys. And you see, it's very hard to see it, but it's not a very good image, but here she is carrying a basket on her head. So that's one example. Here is a portrait of a landscape portrait of Annapolis in the turn of the 19th century, about 1800. Famous landscape artist Charles Milburn, who came through the eastern coast of the United States. And you can see St. Anne's Church there in Annapolis. You see the circle, you see the State House and the various taverns. And as you can see in the left corner there, there's a woman carrying a basket on her head, also a pole, and but she's head carrying. Another example, Baltimore itself, early 19th century, carrying a jug on his head. And then finally, an enslaved girl, one of the slaves who lived on Mount Vernon, as a daughter of a slave who lived on Mount Vernon, also head carrying. Or I could take you to the musical realm. At night and on Sundays, Chesapeake slaves like to dance, accompanied by drums. We've got all sorts of verbal descriptions of those events. On the eastern shore of Maryland in the early 18th century, for example, one visitor talked about the slaves beating their so-called Negro drums by which considerable numbers are drawn together. At mid-century, a Reverend Thomas Bacon, who was resident in Maryland, spoke of that noisy riot and drumming, which seems to be the nightly employment of most quarters. And then most significant, we have an Asante drum, a Gold Coast drum made of African woods, decorated with carvings that came with an African to Virginia, was collected in the colony, and eventually made its way into Hans Sloane's collection in London. So I've just given you a couple of examples of the ways in which the African influence was important, without question, in the Chesapeake, and we can document it in all sorts of ways. So that's my first salient feature of what the black experience was like in the Chesapeake in the 18th century. A second feature. So in early Africanization, we might point to, but a second example, the next second salient feature would be early Creolization. I mean by that the African-American slaves in the Chesapeake rapidly became native born. So that's perhaps most evident. I said that there were about 130,000 Africans brought to the Chesapeake. By the early 19th century, there are about 600,000 African Americans living in this one region. So we've got a rapid increase indeed, and that's largely a function of the slave population growing by an excess of births over deaths, the fact that the population is so prolific. So early in the 18th century, a majority of Chesapeake slaves were natives of the region. So we can speak then of creolization, of people being native born to the region. So by the end of the 18th century, by about 1800, there are really very few African-born slaves left in the Chesapeake. And by 1820, the end of the period I'm looking at, there are virtually none. So there's no other plantation society in the Americas that had a slave population that grew so rapidly and so early in its history from natural increase rather than from immigration. It's an unprecedented event in the New World. So most African Americans can trace their ancestry in the Chesapeake region to many generations back, well before the American Revolution, whereas the largest migration of Europeans and Asians in the United States that began in the late 19th century, those roots are much shallower. So the roots of black Americans are old and deep in this country, particularly those who came from the Chesapeake region. This is the oldest and deepest rooted, as Kaye mentioned. So I wanted to give you a couple of portraits of Creoles, of native-born African Americans in the Chesapeake. The first I'll point to, so here is a very famous Creole, and the person I want to point to is that person in the background. Anybody know his name? Anybody know his name? The person in the background with the turban on his head next to a horse. That's important. You don't know his name? William Lee. William Lee. Yeah, close. So he may be the most famous African American in 18th century America because he's in the company of his most notable master. So William Lee, there he is up close, wearing the red turban. George Washington bought him in 1768 along with his brother Frank. He described them as mulatto boys, in other words, light-skinned blacks of biracial ancestry. He paid more money for the two brothers than usual, than he paid for most other slaves. He installed them close to him, so Frank became his butler, and Frank Lee became his butler, and William Lee became his manservant at Mount Vernon. He was said to be a fearless horseman who galloped at full speed on many occasions, so that in addition to the Trumbull portrait, we also have a French engraving where you can see again him close to horses. He was a particularly good equestrian himself. He went hunting with his master many times a week, and he began calling himself, gave himself his own surname, William Lee, from the widow who had sold him to Washington. He might well be the waiting man, can't see him very well, in this famous Edward Savage portrait of the Washington family in the late 1780s and into the early 1790s. That may be him too. Second Creole I'll mention is Benjamin Banneker, the self-educated mathematician and astronomer, well known for his creation of his various almanacs. The first African-American man of science, as one historian has termed him. He lived his entire life, which spanned 3/4 of a century, in Baltimore County, very close to here. He was the eldest son of Robert, an African, who gained his freedom in the 1720s and who married Mary Banneker, who was herself a biracial daughter of an English servant woman and a husband who was African and a former slave known as Banker or Bannekes. Seemingly from Senegal, his grandfather, perhaps a Fulani. So Benjamin was born in 1731. He was named on the deed of his family's 100-acre farm in 1737 when he was 6 years of age, and he lived on that farm for the rest of his life, and he did many things that brought him to the attention of others such as Thomas Jefferson, and he was part of the commission that surveyed the District of Columbia. So the second salient feature I've emphasized is creolization, the fact that the African American experience in Virginia was one of native born and one of generations. So the third feature I want to turn to is that native born majority clearly facilitated cohesiveness, perhaps more cohesiveness in the Chesapeake than among slaves in other regions, divided as they were between different African groups and between Africans and native born slaves. So as the number of slave men and women became fairly evenly balanced in the Chesapeake, and something that occurred earlier here, as I've said, so it became easier to find husbands and wives. Family life for slaves, although never easy, but it was certainly easier here than for other places. Family life was always precarious because a master could always sell off family members, but nevertheless it was more extensive in the Chesapeake than many other places in the New World. I'm going to give you an example. So take the case of a slave belonging to Charles Carroll of Annapolis, and who lived on Duregan Manor, as Abby will talk about later. This is his son, Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He would own the descendants of a slave woman called Fanny, who was born in 1705, a first-generation native-born black Marylander. In 1773, when she was 68 years of age, she lived at Charles Carroll's home quarter, much the largest of his 10 quarters, and about half of the 130 slaves on that one quarter were either one of Fanny's direct descendants or related to one of her in-laws. So she was surrounded by, so this is an enslaved black Marylander, first generation, who was surrounded by 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. So you can think of the plantation as being one big kinship network almost, centered around her. One of her great-grandchildren was also named after her, perhaps in recognition of her headship of such a large clan. Fanny's kinship network was exceptionally large, but by the Revolution, many Chesapeake slave families radiated outward from intimate ties of blood and marriage to form dense thickets of kin connections. To give you one other example, this is the kinship structure of George Washington's African-American families in 1799. He drew up this list pointing to kinship networks. I know it's hard for you to see from there, but his plantation was essentially 5 farms, Mansion House Farm in the middle, Mansion House Farm in the middle, and then these various quarters of various things. And the only point I want to make to you is that you see these black lines running off the chart or going from one quarter to another. These are marriages that span different quarters. So 2/3 of Washington's slaves had a spouse, had a partner in 1799, but only 1/3 of those had lived on the plantation with their own spouse in their own household. Many of their connections were divided. The majority were. So one spouse lived on the Mansion House Farm, one spouse lived on Muddy Hole Farm, or one spouse lived on Mansion House Farm and another one lived on River Farm. So typically the husband would travel to see the wife in another quarter. So slave quarters were, as Kaye said, places of autonomy, of recreation. You could think of hairstyles as making one cultural statement. So Chesapeake slaves queued their hair, tied them in clubs, even wore wigs. They liked the smooth-shaved look. Apparently, beards were uncommon amongst Chesapeake slaves. We know that they valued the importance of hairdressing and shaving, as you can see here. So that's a third feature. A fourth is that the working environment was an intimate place in the Chesapeake, largely because of the nature of the crops grown in this region, mainly tobacco and wheat. So tobacco required close attention from planting to processing. So tobacco was grown only on a small scale with small groups of slaves. A master or overseer could supervise closely, because you needed to, for the tobacco process to work properly, you needed to supervise just a few field hands. Capital investment was pretty small. You built just tobacco sheds. So again, plantations were small. You packed them into hogsheads and you rolled them onto wharves and placed them on ships. Those exceptional masters who owned scores of slaves, or more unusually 100 or so, somebody like Washington or Jefferson, divided them up into smaller quarters, about 20 laborers per unit, as you can see in that example there. Over time, mixed farming often superseded tobacco as the primary economic activity, and that put an additional premium on small units and skills. So if you say, it's back to my Chestertown image, we can see small groups of slaves gathering hay in a mixed agricultural regime, scything wheat. They might be engaged in animal husbandry, breaking animals. Here's a slave with his lasso. Working with horses and livestock. That became the responsibility of many Chesapeake slaves. So small plantations, fairly equal numbers of whites and blacks, a very close relationship across the racial line. That constituted the typical Chesapeake work setting. So masters had regular contact with their slaves in the Chesapeake. And also, by no means were all slaves field hands. A sizable proportion did skilled work, primarily as woodworkers, blacksmiths, ironworkers, shoemakers, and the like, shipwrights. They worked in transportation as boatmen, as sailors, or as carters and wagoners. So there's a great diversity of skills in the Chesapeake. And of course there was a household elite, people like Billy Lee or Frank Lee at Mount Vernon, or Hercules, George Washington's chef when he was president in Philadelphia, or the Hemmings family in Monticello, another good example of a household elite, or a servant like Alec, noted by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, well appointed and coiffured. So slavery on a small scale encouraged familiarity and cohesion. So that's my fourth salient feature. The fifth is because a majority of Chesapeake slaves were native-born and interacted closely with whites, they tended to adopt Anglo-American mores more readily and completely than slaves in most other New World slave societies. They didn't abandon their African heritage, far from it, but they created a distinctive culture by fusing elements of their African values and beliefs with their manners and habits and thoughts and ways of life of their Anglo-American neighbors. So there's a process of cultural fusion that happened in the Chesapeake that was bound to be more rapid and more thorough because the African influx was quite light and of short duration, as I mentioned. And masters supervised and intervened in many areas of Chesapeake, black life in the Chesapeake. So to give you an example of that very close relationship, talking of wagons, red wagons, this is, I think, a blue wagon. But it's a rather chilling scene, because my last image from Chestertown. So we have a white boy with his little hat on, and he appears to be holding a whip. And he's being pulled by an African-American boy. You know, as I say, it's a rather chilling scene. Learning mastery at a young age, learning to intervene in black life very early on. Or another picture, another image, adult mastery, somebody, a white master on horseback, viewing the world from on high, as you might think of many Chesapeake masters riding around their quarters to see their slaves at work. And then we have this image. What do we make of this? Mastery meaning to be an adult, the dark, seamy underside of slave ownership, the punishments that happened on a regular basis, the sexual predatory behavior. Perhaps the best example of rapid assimilation of Chesapeake slaves is the language spoken by most of them. And we can get at this in the 18th century. We know that many slaves spoke better English than the poor did in England, one visitor said. Some Africans resident only a year or two in the region were said to speak English extraordinarily well. The word Chesapeake masters used to describe the linguistic abilities of their native-born slaves was smooth-tongued. One slave was said to be sober and smooth in his discourse. Another spoke softly and civilly. Another had a masterly speech. Or we might think about slave housing. Here's a reconstructed slave quarter. Very few African influences, I think, in the typical Chesapeake slave housing. There are a few mud-walled slave quarters in the Chesapeake region. Rather, most of them are log or frame structures, much like those that poor whites lived in. Hard-baked earthen floors would be typical and would be familiar to some Africans. But in terms of plan and proportion and building materials, these housing structures are very similar to Euro-Americans. I'll now turn to my last Chesapeake feature, salient feature, which is the dynamism of African-American life in the Chesapeake. I've told that as a general story, but I'd like now to focus on the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in which I'm going to single out two major trends occurring in this period from about 1770 to 1820. The first is that freedom dramatically widened for many blacks during and after the American Revolution. It occurred most obviously in the northern states, with Pennsylvania passing the first gradual emancipation law in 1780, and every state by 1804 north of Maryland had eliminated slavery altogether or set in motion gradual emancipation. But no Chesapeake state passed a gradual emancipation law, although private manumissions became much easier. Driven in part by revolutionary idealism and religious concerns, many Chesapeake masters did free slaves in large numbers. Quakers were in the vanguard, but some of the largest manumissions were in fact came from non-Quakers, such as Robert Carter of Nominally Hall, who in 1791 established a graduated freedom plan for his 500 slaves, or George Washington, who freed over 100 slaves in his 1799 will, or Richard Randolph's emancipation of about 100 African Americans in Prince Edward County in Virginia. Randolph's 1796 will really makes interesting reading. He excoriates his ancestors for having usurped and exercised the most lawless and monstrous tyranny. And he humbly begged his slaves forgiveness. So it's a searing indictment of slavery, that will that emancipated his slaves. In turn, slaves themselves strove to throw off the yoke of bondage by all the strategies open to them. So they purchased their own freedom. Many slaves did in the Chesapeake in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Or they engaged in litigation to try and gain their freedom in the courts. Or they appealed to humanitarian and religious egalitarianism. Or they took off. They ran away. They flew to the north or to the sea. Some could claim wartime service as a reason to be freed. So well, that's the Emancipation Certificate of Robert Carter. I should have moved that on. But there is a figure who gained his freedom in the Revolutionary War because of his wartime service. He worked for the Marquis de Lafayette, James Armstead did, in the late 18th century, and he was a spy, classic double agent. Lafayette left this testimonial to James Armstead when the war was over, in which he said that he'd rendered critical and vital services to the Patriot War effort. James' master tried to reclaim him, and so James was trying to seek his freedom, which he got in January of 1787. This is a rare occurrence, obviously, but it's a tribute to what some slaves were able to do in gaining their freedom in the 1780s. And when Lafayette came back to Virginia in 1824, James Armstead, now James Armstead Lafayette, had this portrait drawn of himself. Some Chesapeake slaves imbibed the values of the American Revolution, and they fought for freedom merely as a good, they said, one person said before, but now they claim it as a right. And probably the best example of that is the conspiracy of slaves led by the charismatic blacksmith Gabriel in Richmond, Virginia in 1800, who, and one of the leaders said, "We have as much right to fight for our liberty as any men." And so some people were challenging slavery on the grounds of natural rights by the late 18th century. And in the 1780s and 90s, a number of slaves turned to Chesapeake courts, as I said, to claim their freedom by claiming descent from a free female ancestor. So in the late 18th century, the Butler clan, an extended network of slaves in southern Maryland who traced their descent from the union of Eleanor Butler, otherwise known as Irish Nell, who had come to Maryland as an indentured servant and married an African named Charles. She married him in 1681. And then you can see all these generations that first generation, then second generation, third, fourth, fifth, that are descended from that one union of 1681. So in the late 1780s, virtually 200 separate freedom suit petitions are launched in various Maryland courts, and over 150 people, some in the sixth generation, great-great-great-grandchildren of Eleanor and Charles, gained their freedom between 1787 and 1800. Other slaves simply fled. About 5,000 Chesapeake slaves left with the British during the American Revolutionary War. Another 4,000 or so escaped to British ships during the War of 1812. And of course, there was always a trickle going northwards into Pennsylvania and places further north. So for a variety of reasons then, the American Revolutionary era undoubtedly witnessed the gradual weakening of the institution of slavery. Idealism, religious faith, economic pressures, black aspirations in self-purchase, litigation, wartime service and flight all meant that the number of free blacks in the Chesapeake region increased at a fast rate in the late 18th and early 19th century. In 1770, only about 3,000 free blacks lived in the region. A half century later, in 1820, almost 100,000 African-American free blacks lived in the region. And Maryland and Baltimore in particular became magnets for free blacks. So in 1820, Maryland had more free blacks than Virginia, which was a much bigger state, and Baltimore with 10,000 free blacks in 1820, 2.5 times the number of slaves in the city, and a sixth of the city's overall population became the largest free black population in the nation. So that's one side of the story of the dynamic growth of the African-American experience in the Revolutionary era. But there's a darker side, because the commitment to slavery also deepened in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Over the same period that I've just mentioned, 1770 to 1820, slavery became more, not less, entrenched. In the half century from 1770 to 1820, the slave population doubled, 250,000 in 1770 to over 500,000 in 1820. So this is a remarkable growth of a slave population in this Chesapeake region. It's far from dying out. It was actually growing rapidly. And at the same time, they were exporting slaves into Kentucky and Tennessee, as we can see here. Roughly from 1780 to 1820, maybe 200,000 slaves left the Chesapeake region to go on the second Middle Passage, as some have termed it. So this coerced migration disrupted slave families and communities, even as slavery gained a firmer grip in the region. So the American Revolutionary era then, as I've just outlined, was double-edged. It marked a new birth of freedom, but it also launched a great expansion of slavery, not just within the Chesapeake, but beyond. So to conclude, in 1820, the Chesapeake region retained its primacy as the most formidable slave society in the young republic. Its slaveholders were the nation's most numerous. They had the most power. They spread their influence the widest. They virtually monopolized the American presidency, didn't they, in its early years. And the Chesapeake became the seedbed of the Deep South, exporting many tens and hundreds of thousands of its slaves south and west to the Chesapeake and Tennessee, to Kentucky and Tennessee, and then further into the Deep Southwest. So as I said at the beginning, the Chesapeake region defined the nature of early American slavery. It was a rather special slave society, as I've emphasized. Yes, resting on an African foundation, but heavily creolized, highly skilled, quite cohesive, with deep and wide kin connections, although they were coming under severe strains by economic pressure and westward expansion. At the same time, the region, particularly Maryland, was fast becoming a significant center for free blacks, particularly at the turn of the 19th century. In this period, Maryland has been termed the middle ground, part slave society, part free. Free blacks established many institutions, churches, schools, self-help organizations in this one region. So for African Americans, both enslaved and free, the Chesapeake was a place of critical, pivotal importance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. That was fabulous. And we truly appreciate the imagery that you've given us to think about today alongside the historical notes you've given to us. So appreciate that very much. I have to say, when you pulled up the one photo of the young manservant of George Washington who was in the shadows you were trying to point out, it reminded me of a very recent event. I had the extraordinary opportunity to lecture at West Point Military Academy back in October. It sounds like an oxymoron or something to go do a race lecture at West Point, but indeed there's a group of students who for the last 3 years I think have been holding these really interesting race conversations among the faculty and students. And so I was very excited to be there, such a beautiful property, such an historical place. But it was interesting, there was a one faculty member who was touring us to all the beautiful buildings, and of course they have portraits galore there, my goodness. Some is bigger than that wall even, they're huge. So this gentleman who was a faculty member said, would you guys like to see the one portrait of an African American that you'll find here at West Point? And the group said, well, yeah, you know. And so he took us into this gorgeous library, at the top floor of this gorgeous library that was sprawled, so you could see the beautiful Hudson River. And we were looking at lots of portraits, and he showed us this amazing, humongous portrait of Robert E. Lee. And of course, there were lots of Robert E. Lee things there at West Point, and we had to work on that. We didn't quite make the connection. But they explained that, you know, a lot, I think, board of directors and Congress together negotiated that if you want this at West Point, you gotta do a Robert E. Lee something. So there's a lot of different things. But here's this huge Robert E. Lee portrait, and he goes, well, and I'm like, well, where's the African-American portrait you're talking about? He said, look closely, just like he did. And we're standing there going, yeah, and way in the, like you said, it was almost identical. Way in the corner is an African slave leading Robert E. Lee's horse away. The only portrait you'll find anywhere on that huge campus. It was an amazing story. Thank you again, Phil, wonderful. We're about to let you stretch your legs, how about that? But we are asking no later than 3:15 regardless, correct? We're going to start right at 3:15, and I'm sure there'll be people about to guide you to the restrooms and what have you. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to seeing you right back. Thank you very much for rejoining our presentations today. We are grateful yet again for your presence, and I don't know about you, but I think the first two presenters were fabulous. We couldn't be more pleased. And we have one, okay, so I should mention that someone left their, it's now ringing. Someone left their phone out that way. If you can identify it, if you're missing your, it was next to the seat. Do you have a friend named Don? No? Nobody has a friend, because he was calling. Okay, I will ask again at the end, but I'm holding a cell phone. Let's move then to our third and final presenter of the day, and keep in mind that after her presentation, we will be opening up the floor for comments and questions. Notice that there is a mic right here at the bottom of the stairs for you to come to ask your questions. However, if mobility in this room is a problem for you, we also have a handheld mic that will be brought to you. But if that's not your problem, we ask that you come forward to this mic, okay? Very good. So our next and last presentation will be given by Abby Birch Schreiber. She is, I talked to her earlier today, and I felt some pride in her voice about the fact that she is currently completing her dissertation, yes indeed, in early American history. And I thought I put the right institution down, but I might have put it down wrong. You were getting that from from Ohio State, which is why that's listed concurrently. There's a lot of Ohio State folks out here. That's why Ohio State is listed along with her Towson University appointment, because she's getting her Ph.D. there. She has a master's degree as well in American material cultures, and she got her bachelor's degree here from Hopkins in history and anthropology. So this is coming home for her, and we're glad to have her. She currently at Towson University is teaching a variety of courses, including Introduction to American Studies. She does a seminar on Maryland plantations then and now, and she does work on the history of the United States to the mid-19th century. And then at Ohio State, she's also taught a course called Launching Americans, and on American civilizations and history courses as well. I love at the moment being in the presence of so many historians as a sociologist, not that I don't know some history, but sociologists approach history in a lot of ways. But I've also been teaching in China over the last few summers, and I have to teach a history course this summer. I don't know why, but they're having me teach a history course. So I'll be calling on all my historian friends to construct that properly. So again, great to be in the presence of Ms. Schreiber. Ms. Schreiber, we all have our phones set to the EMT in case she decides to give birth in the time that she's presenting. I only want to end up by saying that she has a number of other very interesting presentations and panels and things that she's organized. Baltimore Merchants in the Caribbean, and the role of Baltimore merchants in Caribbean material culture, and the spatial turn in American studies, which is always exciting to talk about in the context of American studies issues. So here is a very, very active young woman who is going to be a mommy in a minute and is doing great work as a PhD student. We're glad to have you, Abby.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming back after the break. I know it must have been very tempting to stay outside where it was much cooler and probably a lot more comfortable than it is in here. Hopefully this will, whoops. So, just as a brief autobiographical note, it occurred to me only moments ago that Phil Morgan is actually the reason I'm here today in a sort of roundabout way. Phil was my undergraduate thesis advisor, and in our class we actually did slavery in the Atlantic world, and I read Equiano's narrative for the first time. It was the first time I ever encountered a primary source that had so much to say and so many questions surrounding it. And so that really was an important moment for me, even though I didn't end up writing my undergraduate thesis about slavery or anything related to slavery, really. Moving on through my career as a historian, I find myself now talking about slavery quite a lot through teaching at Towson, my seminar class on Maryland plantations, and also through my involvement at Homewood. So that's why I'm here today, because I have been involved at Homewood for several years now, through a job I had there once, and ongoing as a docent and as a consultant on some digital projects. So, question for the audience: how many of you have never been inside the Homewood Museum? Be honest. I won't judge you. Several of you. Wow. So, an interesting thing that I would like to know about you guys, maybe after the talk, is what brought you here today if you've never been to the museum. I'm assuming, you know, it's the other side of things, the things that we're trying to bring out more in the museum itself. For those of you that have been to Homewood, and I assume most of you that have been on a regular tour, do you remember, did your tour guide talk about slavery at all on your tour? Does anyone, raise your hand if your tour guide mentioned slavery or the enslaved?
Madeira and the person who protected the Madeira.
The person who protected the Madeira? Yeah, that's a good one.
I took 4 children from overseas schools, yes, American children and an Asian child to tour, and the entire time we didn't really hear about the African American experience, so we kind of asked, and the docent opened up a closet and showed 3 porcelain jugs that were imported from Europe, bring the water to the fields.
Okay. I'm familiar with that one as well. Great. Well, so you guys see the problem here. Homewood was a working farm. I'll talk about that more extensively in a bit. But just to lay out my groundwork here up front, we need to talk about slavery at Homewood more. You can't understand an estate like Homewood, a farm that had agricultural laborers, but also a grand mansion that had a number of household staff. The one thing that always impacts me the most on tours is going into the dining room and people saying things like, wow, it must have been so amazing to come to dinner here. And my reaction to that is always like, well, yeah, it was awesome probably, but not if you were not like the 1%. I mean, yeah, exactly. So it's always my instinct to immediately say, yes, it would have been awesome, but there was tons of work going on behind the scenes that we really need to talk about at this moment. And then I tell them all about that. So I think that some of my visitors who are on my tours end up getting a little bit of a different tour than what they wanted. But, you know, again, it's something that I hope, will begin to balance more, this balance between the story of the Carrolls and their occupation and their lifestyle, and the story of everyone else who lived on Homewood Farm. So I'll tell you guys about Homewood a little bit, since it seems that a number of you maybe aren't that familiar with the history of the farm. It was a working farm. It came into the Carroll family in 1800. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, purchased the farm as a wedding gift for his son, whose name is also Charles Carroll. I'll be referring to him as Charles Carroll of Homewood, when he married Harriet Chew of Philadelphia. So the Chew family was a very wealthy family in Philadelphia. So this is a really good match in terms of status and wealth acquisition and, you know, being with your people. The farm was 130 acres. It was about the exact outline that we have on campus today. A little bit extra on the bottom, down where the art museum is, and the Wyman Park Dell area was also part of the original 130 acres. And the farm was meant sort of as a summer retreat for the family. Baltimore City in this period would have been a dangerous place to live in the summertime. Diseases came through and sometimes could kill as many as 30% of the population in port cities in this period. So if you were wealthy and you could afford to get out of there, you did. And the best place was to have a nice country estate where you could have your family and you could also entertain your peers. So the estate was also sort of a project for Charles, younger Charles of Homewood. His father, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, was a very particular kind of man. He was very well-ordered, very conscientious about his duties as a landowner and as a person who was responsible for so many hundreds of other lives. And he really tried to influence his son to follow in his footsteps in that way, to be a responsible plantation owner. The idea here being that Charles Carroll of Homewood would someday inherit his father's holdings and would therefore be responsible for them. As many of you know, that storyline didn't play out exactly the way the family had hoped. That wasn't supposed to be a joke, but I'll take it. So I'll get to that later. The Charles Carroll of Homewood and his wife Harriet had a townhouse in Baltimore City as well, which was on what they called King George Street, and it's now Lombard Street. The house is gone. But they did have a probably very nice townhouse. We don't know a lot about it, but they would have taken household servants and slaves between the two dwellings on a seasonal basis. And this seasonal movement of households was very typical. Charles Carroll of Carrollton did it throughout his life with his estates, moving from Doregan Manor in Howard County, or what's now Howard County, to his townhouse in Annapolis, where he maintained a pretty large staff as well. So when we think about Homewood, we have to think about it as a part of a larger system of agriculture and of laborers. Homewood was not an island, geographically speaking or economically speaking. It certainly was Charles Carroll of Carrollton's hope that his son could be economically viable on his own. But if you've ever read any of the letters between father and son, as I know some of you have, you'll know that that was constantly not happening. Charles of Homewood was always overspending his budgets, always borrowing money from his father, always dipping into his inheritance, basically, trying to get a better lifestyle, or support a better lifestyle. So even though Homewood should have been, or maybe could have been, a profitable farm with the labor force that it had, I don't think that it ever really was. It was a gentleman's occupation, where Charles of Homewood sort of occupied his time and pretended at being a gentleman. I mean, he was a gentleman, but he went through the motions of being a gentleman and didn't do very well on the farmer side, despite all the support from his father and from farm managers that he hired throughout the years. So we know that when the Carrolls purchased Homewood, there were some buildings here. There was a farmhouse that they write about in the letters, and there were some outbuildings present. We never have any evidence in any of the letters that the Carrolls ever built slave dwellings on Homewood, but we know that there were slave dwellings because the slaves had to live somewhere. So it's probable that those dwellings may have already existed when the Carrolls acquired the property. I should probably say a little more about the sources that we have for these things. Most of what we have to tell us about the enslaved experience at Homewood is through letters, correspondence in the Carroll family. That's one of the reasons that I don't have very many slides for you guys to see, despite my background as a material culturist who thrives on visual evidence. We just don't have any visual evidence for Homewood. We don't have, photographs that we can say, this was a person who was enslaved at Homewood or anything like that. So I've reinforced that for you guys by making you stare at a blank screen. So the farmhouse that initially existed on Homewood was deemed not nice enough, basically, or insufficient, I think is the word they use in the letters, for the Carroll family to use. It wasn't of the current style. Charles was very interested in portraying himself as a man of means and of style, that he knew, what was fashionable. And so his father finally agreed to give him some additional money to build a summer cottage. So from 1801 to 1806, Homewood was under construction. The initial gift from his father was supposed to be $10,000 to build this grand summer house. Charles ended up spending $40,000, which was a huge sum of money in this period, just an unbelievable sum. And of course, all along the way, his father is complaining and complaining about, you really don't need to spend money on this thing or that thing. Or maybe you shouldn't let your builders talk you into adding these flourishes onto your house. Maybe you could do with something a little more modest. But nonetheless, we end up with Homewood, which is great for us because it's a great example of federal period architecture, but maybe wasn't so great for Charles and his relationship with his father. We know that there were several outbuildings that Charles either redesigned or repurposed or constructed at the same time. Some of them are still existing. The carriage house, you guys maybe are familiar with the building that's now, that's still on campus, and the privy, which we still have, which is pretty remarkable. So there's a lot of other buildings that were like smokehouses, dairy house, ice house, bathhouse. So lots of other little subsidiary buildings that they mention in the letters. Unfortunately, like I said, they don't really talk about slave dwellings in any detail. So the family probably started living in Homewood around 1802 in the summer, and it was probably still under construction at that time. So they were living there only seasonally, as I said, but they are still putting the finishing touches on the house for the most part for a few more years after that. So like I said, the house, Homewood Farm, was meant to be Charles Carroll of Homewood's responsibility. He was supposed to have, well, there was an expectation that he would have some interaction economically with his father's estate, which was extensive. But Charles Carroll of Carrollton really thought of Homewood as an independent institution, economically speaking. Like I said, though, that didn't really bear out into reality. Charles Carroll of Homewood was constantly asking for his father to send workers or slaves, even skilled craftsmen to Homewood to do different tasks like carpenters. And he was also constantly borrowing food off of his dad, which, if you guys have college-aged kids, maybe you have experienced that. But he's borrowing, like, you know, lots and lots of grain to feed his workforce. So this isn't just a small amount of food. And some other things like fruits, and he tries to get pork off of him a couple of times. So we have to think of Homewood as part of this larger constellation of Carroll properties. The reason that we need to consider that is because of the enslaved laborers. It was common practice in the Carroll family and in other families as well who had lots of land holdings to transfer their workforces between their properties. And there was a long history of this in the Carroll family. Charles Carroll of Annapolis, Charles Carroll of Carrollton's father, did this, established this pattern, and did it very purposefully. There were several estates that he rotated his workers around on. And his son, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, learned that practice from him and hoped, of course, to pass it on to his son as well. So Phil talked earlier about the expansion of slavery in Maryland, and we see that coming out in the Carroll family as well. Charles Carroll of Annapolis, who was the head of the family through the middle of the 18th century, expanded the enslaved population on his holdings from just over 100 to almost 400 individuals by the time he passed away. So this is a lot of people, a lot of enslaved individuals. They also had unfree white laborers, indentured servants, and redemptioners, which were a different sort of unfree labor, and also some regular paid servants or paid skilled workmen, overseers, things like that. So in 1790, the federal census lists 300 slaves just on Doregan, which is the Howard County estate, which was about 13,000 acres. So there was a pretty sizable workforce out there. Homewood didn't have an enslaved population that was by any means that large. It was much smaller. One characteristic of the Carrolls as slave owners and of the enslaved experience for those who were enslaved by the Carrolls is that they did seem to recognize family connections and cultivate them. So Phil mentioned the, sorry, I'm blanking on her name, Fanny, on Doregan at the home quarter, having all these descendants who stayed on the Carroll, or who were kept on the Carroll in the Carroll family in their possession. And we see that happening into the 19th century as well, that when we see evidence of enslaved people, we do see it in family groupings. Charles Carroll of Carrollton wrote that he believed that keeping families together kept people happier and kept them from wasting time, basically. He discouraged the practice of marrying off of the quarter on which one lived because it led to a lot of traveling back and forth between the quarters for family visits. So he did prefer to keep his slave family units intact. We see that Charles Carroll of Annapolis kept, for the most part, almost all children who were enslaved lived with their parents, if their parents were there. If they weren't, it was often their aunts and uncles or their grandparents that they lived with. So this is a practice in the Carroll family that we see continuing on through Charles Carroll of Homewood. The one exception to this is at the Annapolis house, where Charles Carroll of Carrollton spent his winters. And there seemed to be a relatively large population of young children and young adults who were sent to the Annapolis house, probably for domestic training, and were not therefore living with their parents while they were there at the end of the 18th century. So Charles Carroll of Carrollton was taught by his father to use all these family holdings in concert. He thought of them as supporting each other and making a self-sustaining whole. That one place, like Doregan, would grow tobacco. Another place would grow more wheat. And that all these together would support one another. And they would end up having enough food, enough supplies. Eventually, they had a textile sort of manufactory at Doregan, where they even made cloth and clothing. So this whole idea of everything being self-sufficient. So by the end of the 19th century, the Carroll holdings are in the tens of thousands of acres. Probably at their peak, it was around 40,000 acres that they actually owned and controlled, which is quite a lot of land. Much of that they were collecting rents on, they had tenants on, so they weren't directly farming it. But the ones that they were directly farming were Doregan, which I mentioned, which was about 12,000 acres. The Annapolis quarter, which was considerably smaller than that, only a couple hundred acres. And Poplar Island, which was a 1,000 acre lease that they had, where they had a salt works eventually, and also produced some crops there. So Homewood was added into this constellation of work sites, of farms that were all designed to enrich the Carroll family. So one of the questions about Homewood specifically that I've already actually been asked, I think twice today, is how many people actually worked here? How many enslaved laborers were there? And the sad answer is that we don't actually know for sure. There aren't. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was an amazing record keeper, amazing letter writer, very prolific in those ways. His son was not. And so we don't have a lot of surviving accounts from Homewood. We don't have a lot of very detailed letters telling us exactly what was going on the farm at different times. So we have a couple of censuses of slave laborers that date to sort of random times that help us see a little bit of the continuity of people in these places. And then we have random mentions of people in letters. And usually it's very little. Someone will be listed as, carrying a letter to one Carroll or the other, and that's all that will be said about them. And, and for some of these people, it's an assumption that because they're being sent to carry a letter, that means that they're an enslaved person. They don't actually, tell us outright, the whole details of their employment situation or their captivity situation. So, we have to sort of approach our look at Homewood with a little bit of maybe more open-mindedness than we would like in terms of thinking creatively about the sources, questioning, what is the meaning of this in this context, comparing it to other contexts that we're a little more familiar with. So back to the size of the labor force. An estimate is all I can give you. Probably on the agricultural side, somewhere between 15 and 20 people at any given time. On the domestic side, probably 6 to 8 people. And this would include all workers, not just the enslaved. So we know that Charles Carroll of Carrollton often hired seasonal employees or even sometimes mildly skilled free workers to supplement his workforce. This was especially true during times of harvest where they had a really high demand to get lots of work done very quickly. And it's likely that Charles Carroll of Homewood also practiced populated his labor force in a similar way. We also know that Charles Carroll of Carrollton would send workers to Homewood for certain projects. He often tried to avoid doing that by saying, I can't spare these workers, but his son would say, it's the most expedient way, really. So then he would ultimately get the workers. So Charles Carroll of Carrollton, kind of a pushover, right? From all of his kids, kind of did that to him, I think, and his grandchildren. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. So back to the slaves, the enslaved on Homewood. We don't know a lot about them. Like, what was their life like? What kind of things did they do with their time other than work? We don't have a lot of detail about that in the letters because, it's not the Carrolls' prerogative to describe to one another what's going on with their labor forces, except for just really in passing. One thing that we can talk about a little bit are the dwellings that I mentioned. Even though we don't know exactly what the dwellings at Homewood looked like, we know that they probably had at least one and possibly as many as 3 or 4 slave dwellings, just based on the size of the labor force and the fact that they certainly had at least 2 family units on the property at any given time. So these are examples of other existing slave dwellings. The one on the left is Doregan's. So, assuming that there's some familial influence in terms of how slaves are maintained, we could expect that the slave dwellings on Homewood probably looked similar to what we see at Doregan, even though it's probable that Charles Carroll of Homewood didn't actually build the slave dwellings. He would have expected his slaves to live in dwellings of a certain caliber. When you read 19th century correspondence, you see very quickly that for some slave owners, the way that they kept their slaves was a mark of pride. We see this at Ridgely with the Ridgeleys at Hampton, especially, that when their friends visited them, they wanted to be able to say, look how well I keep my slaves, look at these great houses they have to live in. This other example from Blandair is just another regional example that shows a fireplace that splits the dwelling in half. So in this case, maybe two families lived in this side by side, or maybe one side was more for domestic laborers and the other side was for other purposes like sleeping and things. But just as a quick reminder, slave dwellings were usually 1 room, maybe 2, and they usually had a whole family unit in them. So we're talking 2 adults at minimum, and then several children, 6 to 10 children in one house at any given time. And then, of course, those children's age range being pretty substantial, into the late teens down to infant. As we see that in the Carroll records even. So it's possible that there was a slave dwelling here on campus up until this century. Some of you may remember this building. I think it was called Olin, yeah. This house here, this may have been the farmhouse that they referred to in the letters early on in the acquisition of the property. And it was actually right here on the site of Remsen Hall. At some point in its history, a little piece was added onto it in the back, which was maybe a 2-room dwelling, which in this context, we would assume that would be a slave dwelling. So this house was demolished in 2002, actually. They did document it a little bit before, once they realized the age of the structure, they documented it a little bit, but it's possible that this building still existed on campus until just a few years ago, relatively, and that it was somewhere that slaves lived. So to tie this all back into the narrative of the enslaved at Homewood, besides the fact that it's a place where they might have lived, right away when Charles Carroll of Carrollton purchased Homewood for his son, he sent a slave and his wife to take care of the property, to watch it basically, to maintain the buildings and make sure that no one got into them. So we have evidence that Ben and his wife were sent from Doregan to care for the buildings, and it's possible that they lived in a slave dwelling like this. And maybe they lived in the farmhouse, but that seems like it would be unlikely that they would be allowed to live there, even if it was otherwise vacant. So going back to the records that we have an 1825 inventory, skipping way ahead into the future. So Charles Carroll of Homewood lived at Homewood until about 1816. Some of you are familiar with the story. Charles was an alcoholic, and ultimately Harriet took the children back to Philadelphia and lived there for the rest of her life. They separated, and then he died at a pretty young age in 1825. So in 1825, we do have an inventory of the slaves that were owned by Charles Carroll of Homewood. This inventory lists 16 enslaved people, 5 adult males, 3 adult females, and 8 children, all from one family, who we actually know the name of, the Connor family. And these children ranged in age from 14 to an infant. One of the things about all this movement of people and goods between all these different plantations or farms is that ownership becomes contested. Charles Carroll of Carrollton would often send his workers to Homewood and to his other children as well, sort of as a gift, but not really. He still sort of claimed them. So we get these interesting contestations as people start passing away and estates are evaluated, of people, Charles Carroll of Carrollton saying, this Connor family belongs to me, and then Charles Carroll of Doregan, who is the son of Charles Carroll of Homewood, saying, no, they belong to my father, so now they belong to me. So even in the family, there's not real agreement on who legally has title to these people. And that comes out in some interesting stories, actually. So the Connor family was headed by Isidod and Sis, and they were actually moved around quite a lot by the Carrolls. Isidod was a gardener. He was a skilled laborer. There's a number of skilled laborers that we see in the inventories of Charles Carroll of Carrollton slaves, ranging from things like, for the women, we see a lot of knitters and spinners listed. For the men, we see carpenters, gardeners, blacksmiths, coachmen, ditch diggers, all kinds of stuff. So Isidod was a gardener. Charles Carroll of Homewood sometimes asked for Isidod to come to Homewood to help him with his gardens. And I guess Isidod must have been a very skilled gardener, because Charles Carroll of Carrollton was very hesitant to ever let him go to Homewood. He suggested to his son that he should put an ad in the newspaper and find a gardener of his own, rather than take his father's gardener. So ultimately, though, in 1805, Sis, his wife, was sent to Homewood to work in the household for Harriet. There was a caveat that if she met to Harriet's satisfaction, she would be able to stay at Homewood. But it seems that she probably did, because we see in the letters that Isidod is actually carrying a lot of the letters back and forth between Charles Carroll of Carrollton and his son at Homewood. So the only reason that he would be going back and forth that frequently is to see his wife. This family was with Charles Carroll of Homewood and his family pretty regularly. It seems that they were familiar with each other. The 2 eldest children, Mary and Joseph, ultimately went with Harriet to Philadelphia in 1816 when she moved her household there. Isidod was also the target of one of the few examples where we get any sense of what Charles Carroll of Homewood felt or how he acted toward his enslaved workers. Isidod committed some offense, which he doesn't describe in the letter, but Charles was so enraged, he immediately started to whip him, and in the process injured himself with the butt of the whip. So he this is why he told his father about it in a letter. So his father suggested to his son, that he should never angrily strike a slave, but rather have Ben, the overseer of Homewood, who had been at Homewood since 1800, lay on the lashes for him. And that if it was a minor offense, they should receive 25 lashes. If it was a more egregious offense, 39 lashes. So that's a pretty detailed directive on how to treat slaves. This is one instance in a lot of letters of this happening. We know that they did whip their slaves, excuse me, but this is the only example in the letters between father and son that we see Charles acting out in this way, in a way that he admits to. You know, the other side of that, with going back to questioning our sources, is, you know, how much didn't Charles Carroll of Homewood tell his father? So I'm going to skip ahead to a little bit of a story about that. So when Charles and Harriet were having problems in their marriage, starting in 1814, really, Harriet removed herself from Homewood quite a bit, went up to Philadelphia, and she took with her a slave named Charity Castle. In Pennsylvania at this time, there was a law preventing people from bringing slaves into the state. So people who were traveling in Pennsylvania could have their slaves for up to 6 months. After that time, their slaves were manumitted. So Harriet went to Philadelphia not intending to stay for 6 months, but probably because of Charles' degradation, basically, she was not able to go back to Homewood. So Charity Castle was coming up on her 6-month period. So they start sending letters between Harriet, her brother Benjamin, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton, trying to figure out, how do we get Charity back into Maryland so we don't lose her as a slave? Harriet wants to send Charity back to Homewood, where she was supposed to be. But Charity begged her not to. So this all comes out in this pretty dramatic way, where Harriet begs Charity to tell her what's going on, and after much persuasion, Charity finally tells her this story that makes her so upset and revulsed that she goes to bed and secludes herself. And then Benjamin, her brother, Harriet's brother, you know, tries to elicit the story out of Harriet, and she's so upset and embarrassed by it that she can't even tell him what's going on. But finally, he convinces her that she must tell him. All of this building up to Benjamin, the brother of Harriet, writing to Charles Carroll of Carrollton that Charity claims that, quote, attempts have been essayed that delicacy forbids me to particularize. It seems obvious to us what's going on, right? I mean, Charles Carroll of Homewood was probably sexually assaulting Charity. And she didn't want to go back to Homewood in this setting where Harriet wouldn't be there and where Charles would be basically able to do whatever he wanted with her. So the story gets even more complicated in that ultimately someone does get sent from Homewood to Philadelphia to get Charity and take her back. Charles of Homewood is claiming that she is his slave and she has to come back to him. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is claiming that she's his slave and has to come back to him. So before any of that can happen, though, Charity meets with an accident. She falls while getting wood from the back lot and is injured so badly that she almost dies. And she's actually laid up in bed for quite some time. And of course, as that time passes, the 6 months also passes. So then her case becomes a legal case, actually. The Abolition Society gets involved and advocates for her that she is free because the Carrolls have retained her past the 6 months. And the Carrolls actually argue that no, they didn't retain her. They were helping her. They were providing health care for her, basically. And that it's not their fault that she stayed there for more than 6 months. It's fate or misfortune, or in their case, fortune. So there's this whole legal argument about her status, whether she's enslaved, whether she's free. Her husband decides to, with the help of the Abolition Society, threaten to sue the Carrolls for her freedom. And Charles Carroll of Homewood actually reacts to this interestingly, saying that he doesn't want to have a lawsuit brought because it might embarrass his wife and children, which to me indicates even more that he, was assaulting her and didn't want that to come out in court, basically, where it would be recorded. So Charity ends up, a deal gets made that Charity's husband can buy her for $300. And that's sort of where they leave it. Whether or not she actually was purchased by her husband is unclear in the records. And whether or not she was ultimately free is also unclear, though it seems very likely that through the Abolition Society and with her husband there advocating for her, that she probably did attain her freedom. So I am out of time, and there's several other stories of individuals who were enslaved at Homewood that we know some things about, but ultimately, it's spotty information. We can't trace these generations, or we can't create this grand narrative of what it was like on a day-to-day basis for the enslaved at Homewood. But we can, drawing from these different sources, drawing from the wider context of the family's history of slave ownership, understand a little bit more about what was going on at Homewood. So by the 1830s, Carroll slaves probably weren't living at Homewood anymore. Once Charles died, his son acquired the property and lived here. He probably did have slaves, but it's not clear how much he was actually farming at that time. And then Charles Carroll of Doregan, went back to Doregan and lived on that estate after his grandfather died, where he did have control of all of the Carroll family slaves. So I guess I will leave it at that. I look forward to speaking with you guys more during the Q&A session. And thank you for your time.
Very nice, Abby. Thank you so much. That was great information about our beloved Homewood. Well, we're at the point in the program where we are going to allow you to expand this conversation by asking your questions. The questions can be put to the panel, to the museum managers, to each other, perhaps. If you wouldn't mind coming to the mic, sir.
Good afternoon, all. I'm Michael Bowen Mitchell, the grandson of Lily Mae Carroll Jackson. And those of you historians might note my reference to the Carroll. I think the rocks would cry if I didn't pose the general question that we have this rather genteel conversation when in fact Homewood was a plantation and was run by slave labor. And the Charlie Carroll of Homewood, whatever they call him, was mentally challenged, most historians will agree, and that this father, and I'm glad you pointed out the letter, young lady, where Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the major correspondence to the son, was to administer more lashes to slaves who got out of line at Homewood. And I'm just wondering, in this whole notion of Homewood, why there's been, what it really is, and I really think we've got to address the facts of what Homewood really was. I think it got rescued by the Quakers in Maryland, but it was a kind of a vestige of a plantation, and it might be better to name it Homewood Plantation. And I was just wondering, for points of discussion, what your comments were. The final thing is Professor Morgan, the DOO spelling of Reagan, and I was wondering why it subsequently changed for the DOU. I don't know if that's relevant or whatever, but and we should note that Charles Carroll tonight, didn't hear any reference, was the largest slaveholder in the colonies and was one of Maryland's 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you very much. Would anyone like to begin to answer those questions?
I'll start with that. We just listened to Abby Schreiber talk to us and sort of try to distinguish for us the difference between plantation in sort of the true scholarly sense versus working farm. And to me, it doesn't change the fact that Charles Carroll of Homewood owned slaves, but we just heard about the more limited scope of the farming operations here and the significantly fewer number of slaves that were at Homewood versus Reagan. I mean, what we're talking about was about 15 to 20 working on the farm, 6 to 8 in the house. The Reagan censuses get it up into 300 and 400. So I don't in any way mean to diminish difference in treatment, only to say difference in measure and scope of Homewood's farming operations. Do you want to add anything to that? I know I've spoken with Dr. Kiefer Mitchell a number of times, and Judith Prophet and I have had lunch with him, and he's talked to us about, I know that you are, as a Mitchell, you are a Carroll descendant, and so there are a number of,
You said it.
yeah, this is what we believe to be true, and so just like with the story of Monticello and their change in interpretation and embracing the full Jefferson family, we hope that some of our future conversations will go in that direction. I've also always wondered, as all of you know, the Mitchell family's prominence in local politics. And I think that this may connect back to the sort of political acumen, not any that was held by Charles Carroll of Homewood, I have to say, but a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And because I believe that it's not completely known. Dr. Mitchell says he knows, but he has not told me at which generation the Mitchell family begins. We think that it's Charles Carroll of Annapolis or the signer. It happens before Charles Carroll of Homewood, is my understanding from talking to Dr. Mitchell. But at any rate, it would tend to support that, that your family's prominence in local politics may, in large part, have some aspect of this inherited political acumen.
We were not slave owners.
I'm not saying that part of it, I'm just... Anyway, I've also recently been in conversation with a woman named Askira Bailey, and she has a family tradition of descent. They think, they're not entirely sure which generation it is, but when we look more closely in these Reagan slave censuses from the 1830s, there is a slave named Rachel. She is married to, or she has a son named Yellow Harry. Do you think Yellow Harry might be mulatto? And maybe that's where this comes into play. So her family, her aunts are planning a family reunion. I had invited her and hoped that she would be able to be here today. But they've been contacted by a member of the white part of the Carroll family about, they had DNA analysis done, and it was suggested that these might be some of their closest relatives. I don't know if any of you have had ancestry, DNA done, but the reports that come back will suggest to you people in the United States or abroad that are your closest genetic match if they've all. So we really look forward to continuing this conversation, and I hope that the Mitchell family will be a really big part of this.
I want to speak to that as well. Not to the history that the senator shared. I want to speak to this idea of having these genteel conversations about American slavery and the fact that it is a comfortable way that we talk about this very uncomfortable topic. There used to be a time when you would talk about American enslavement, people would get enraged, passion and anger. And whether it was anger at the situation, whether it was regret, whether it was feeling guilty, whatever feelings came out, they were a part of it. America has come to a place now where we can talk about these, and it's very comfortable, it's very genteel, it's very modest, it's very easy, and it really shouldn't be. And I would argue, and this is the way I approach history, that history is something that has to be wrestled with. Like, it's messy. And it's hard to kind of understand that from this messiness, we evolved from this. And I use the word evolve because to come from being a slave-holding nation to where we are now, that's evolution. Yeah. Now, either it's intellectual evolution, emotional evolution, but something has shifted in our understanding of who we are as people. So just that part about being genteel, my hope is in, when I really frame this notion of American enslavement, that to speak to that it is not genteel. It was work on the backs of men, women, and children. And any person who was not a black person who aligned themselves with the struggle also put their lives in danger. I think it's important to speak about that because all the way throughout history, there's been both blacks and whites and Native Americans trying to push this country to being a more perfect union. And then finally around the DNA, it happened during the time with the Hemmings of Monticello. And one of the descendants said, why is it that as a black person, we have to go through so much to prove that the people actually owned us and that miscegenation and rape took place? Like, we're doing all of these studies where you can pop up any day as a white person in this country and you can trace all the way back to the Mayflower and we take it at face value. So that's my second point. And then my third point, which I thought was very interesting, around connecting the signing of the Constitution to the political DNA of the Mitchell family, I would kind of reverse that. Maybe it's the idea that you have this unusual situation and people have forged their way through that they feel it's necessary to be involved in how we shape what we're doing. But I think that's the way I see it. I mean, I am not from Baltimore. I mean, I've been here 10 years. It's like I got here yesterday. But I do know you can't speak of politics in this city if you don't mention the Mitchells. And every time I turn around, I'm meeting a Mitchell who reminds me of how important it is to speak about the Mitchells. So I wouldn't trace their political acumen back to a slave-holding crazy man. I'd probably say that it's just coming from all of this and figuring out who we are and what that means and saying if we want to be better, then we have to be involved in making it better.
Maybe I could just, on plantation and farm, the difference between the two. It's interesting, in the 17th century, all agricultural settlements in the colonies were called plantations. It was just a planting of people, that's all it meant. Didn't have any other signifier. I think we now associate plantations with staple crop production, I guess, and forced labor. But it didn't have that necessary connotation in the beginning. And the shift from plantation to farm is simply to indicate that a lot of planters in the Chesapeake in particular got away from staple crop production and moved into a mixed farming regime where they're growing a range of grains. So it looks like many other agricultural regimes, and they simply wanted to signify that change, and so they preferred to call themselves farmers rather than planters. That's simply what they meant if you just follow the evolution of the terms.
Thank you. There was also a question about the change or misspelling of Duregan. Anybody have a reaction to that? Know anything about its accurate spelling?
I think.
You wonder if that was the original Irish?
Yeah,
I believe it's the original Irish spelling. Yeah. I think it's the original Irish spelling of Duregan.
Yeah, you see it spelled several different ways through time.
They're creative spellers in the 18th century anyway. So.
Yeah.
Good.
Sometimes with no H at all. So
right.
it changes. It's not necessarily meaningful, other than maybe you could argue that it's more anglicized or
Probably.
Americanized rather through time.
Good, and thank you. Next question, please. Yes.
Hi.
Sir.
Oh.
Sir, I'll call on you next, okay?
Okay. When you mentioned that it was a $10,000 initial expense.
I'm sorry, she's not on.
All right. Nope. Okay. When you mentioned $10,000 as the price initially given for the cost of construction of the mansion, and then later more money, so it went up to $40,000, is there any accounting at all for the value of slave labor in that? And how does one account for the value of slave labor in any of the figures that are given out for the costs of things back then?
That's a great question. For the slaves that Charles Carroll of Carrollton gave his son as part of his wedding gift, that was separate from the expense of the house. He talks about giving Charles and Harriet the property, the farm, but also a carriage and servants, etc. So they're lumped into the initial wedding gift with the property itself.
Those are things, the actual value of the labor.
Yeah.
That are accounted for?
There have been economists who have tried to come up with figures.
And I do have some of those. If I just wanted to add a little bit, if you don't mind. Sure. That one of the things that the economists have looked at, that at the time of the ending of the Civil War in 1865, enslaved African Americans were worth $3.5 billion. That if at that moment you piled up all of the resources, trains, factories, houses, and measured it up against the enslaved population, it doesn't even compare. In fact, it doesn't even compare when we look at oil today, to have bodies worth $3.5 billion. So that's just a little bit of flesh around that, but also understanding that was 4 million enslaved people.
And as many of you probably know, if you follow certain threads of media discussion, they're about, I don't know, every few years or so, there's a raising of the issue of reparations. And that reparations discussion reflects directly on this value. I think people often mistake people being greedy, that this is about being greedy and wanting to get some money out of something for nothing kind of idea. It's more principled than that. It's the idea that, in fact, at those values, there were people who lost their lives, whose lives were broken, whose families were destroyed in order to make somebody else some money. And we all know how America works today. Everybody's supposed to get what they've earned, so to speak, right? And so that's what, and again, I see discussions of this come about every 3 or 4 years. You see a thrust of that where these figures are tossed about. And it's not so much that they're trying to make sure that money actually comes up from somewhere and gets distributed. It's the principle that someday you will, in fact, acknowledge that that is the figure.
Now, what's interesting, if I may, with this idea of reparations, is that it gets messy and complicated. I wrote a series of op-eds for the Baltimore Sun during February. I was their op-ed special guest columnist on race relations, talking about how messy reparations is. It's like, do we give people checks? Right. Is it like food? Like how do you really make this work? And it's really based upon that promise that Lincoln signed on to provide every formerly enslaved person with the 40 acres, a mule, and the $50. But the fact that that was in place for 6 months and then discontinued, right, that people are saying there was no way to begin to make a life for yourself. My family, you talk a little bit about yours, my mother's family actually received their 40 acres and their mule, and it's still in our family today. I mean, one of the things I do with my kids every year, we go back and we see the 40 acres. Now it is, swampland. You can't build, you can't plant, you can't do anything with it. But it's just the notion for me and for my sons to recognize that our people were owned, but we were people, and that there was some humanity there, that they have held on not just to this property, but to the records, to say, you know what, this is just a little notice that we were here and that we mattered. And so for some, reparations is not really about the money. No. Because where's it going to come from? I mean, we don't have any money in this country. We owe China so much. Let me say, but where does the money come from? Or is it just recognizing that this terrible thing happened, and we've got to find a way to perhaps figure it out for the long descendants from that? Because Ta-Nehisi's Coates' article on reparations, he wasn't talking about going back to American slavery, right? Enslavement. He was talking about just going back to Jim Crow, right, where people couldn't even get houses, or when they did get loans, the loans were taken away from them. So reparations is a long, kind of complicated discussion that we haven't even figured out. I mean, I think there are parts of the South we just have to recognize that slavery's over and get them to apologize and admit it before we start talking about writing checks, right?
And I think some of the reparations is symbolic. Like you said, it's really a symbolic thing. I mean, and symbols, that symbolism can come in lots of different ways. But for some families, for just to have the gesture extended, give me a medallion or something, I don't know. But just to have the gesture extended is huge. But we haven't even been able to imagine that yet.
Very quickly, back to your original question about accounting for slave labor in the construction of Homewood. Judith Proffitt, our programs and membership coordinator, in 2002 curated an exhibition called Building Homewood, where we and some other outside scholars looked as deeply as we possibly could into then known Carroll records and documents. We cannot find any specific evidence at this point. Hopefully it's out there to turn up later. I think any of us involved with that project would tell you we are virtually certain that there were slaves owned by the Carrolls that participated in the construction of the house. Which ones, how many hours, what that translates to in terms of dollar worth, we really don't know. There are a couple letters talking about movement of stone cutters, but whether those are paid stone cutters or enslaved stone cutters moving back and forth between Duregan and Homewood. We know the names of the builders who were white, Robert and William Edwards. We just have not discovered letters where the Carrolls, whether that's Charles Carroll of Homewood, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, are offering up, I have these 10 young, strong laborers, or there are carpenters listed in the slave censuses for Duregan, but that's taken in 1833. So there's just no, Samuel, who worked on Homewood, you just wish that there was that extra level of detail. So we hope that some more of there are some letters still privately held. There are some incredible details of other aspects of Homewood that have come to light just in the last 2 or 3 years. So we remain hopeful that we will know more of that. But I believe without doubt that there were Carroll-owned slaves that helped build the house.
Thank you very much. Sir. Sir. Oh, there you are. Okay. And I do recognize you next, ma'am.
Good evening.
Evening.
I want to thank you all, first of all, for the enlightening lectures that I've heard this evening, so I really am appreciative of that. I just have a quick question. I don't know if it's anything of import, but I am curious about it, and I actually came up with a question based upon what I heard tonight. What I was getting about slavery in terms of the remembrance of slavery is that there are certain issues that are still lingering within the African American community in terms of names. That issue is still an issue that's lingering. And some have even tied the issue of colorism to this whole issue of slavery. And I was just curious, I don't know that much about Maryland history or Baltimore in particular, but is there maybe something that may have been peculiar to Maryland, maybe even to Baltimore in terms of enslavement or maybe just race relations that has a lingering impact on Baltimore or on Maryland that maybe in other states, because of different cultures and different ways that maybe slavery was practiced, doesn't happen there?
Very good question. Any takers?
No, I guess I will step in, and I'm not a Baltimore historian. I focus on Philadelphia. But I did do a comparative analysis looking at free women and enslaved women in Baltimore, Maryland. One of the things I know about race relations in Philadelphia coming out of the 18th century is that race was very important. Being mulatto versus being colored really denoted where you were. I mean, this is what was on the census. If you were someone who's colored, it meant that you were probably formerly enslaved or that you had darker skin. Mulatto meant you had lighter skin. In Philadelphia, which was some parts of Baltimore, not completely, where you lived depended upon the color of your skin. So if you were mulatto, you lived in better communities. You had better jobs. You were typically educated. If you were black, there was a color line. And Frederick Douglass, when he compared Baltimore with Philadelphia, said the problem that's going to pull down Philadelphia is the color line. With Baltimore, you also had the influx of people who were enslaved and free kind of moving in the same communities. When you think about Frederick Douglass moving through and his ability to be able to kind of steal himself, it's because you had that community, unlike in Philadelphia where the color line was very deeply divided in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of who you married. People who were mulatto were endogamous, where they only married mulatto people. So I don't know. I'm going to come to my colleague. I know he knows a lot about the Chesapeake. That might help to kind of fill it out a bit.
I just think Baltimore's a rich melange of different people of different statuses. That's rather unusual, and it's got some similarities with other southern cities and towns. So it's got some. You could compare it to Charleston and New Orleans and Norfolk and so on. It's got some similarities with them, with the slave population, but it's got this rapidly growing large free black population, the largest in the nation, and it has that by the early 19th century. And it has a lot of people who are quasi-slave, quasi-free, people who have what's called, who are under the system of term slavery, and maybe have to serve another 8 or 10 years before they become free. They have a contract to say that they will become free, but it's at a particular delayed point, maybe 8, 10, or maybe when they reach a certain age, 21, 27, 28, something like that. So it's a really rather rich mosaic is Baltimore, I would say, but the largest free black population in the nation. That's unquestionable.
One thing I'd like to add to this is someone you may enjoy talking with at the reception afterwards, if she's still around, is Mary Ellen Hayward in the audience, who wrote I don't think we got it because I'm remembering it right now, into our bibliography, but the introduction to the Maryland Historical Society's Joshua Johnson catalog, which is from about 1987, does a really good job in a succinct essay of laying out this sort of, particularly kind of the Fells Point and Old Town areas of Baltimore, and sort of painting a really clear picture of these various statuses of freedom or lack thereof, all living sort of side by side in that area. So Mary Ellen Hayward, if you'll raise your hand, go talk to her when we're done. She can tell you more.
Great, thank you. Ma'am, we have, there was a woman here, yes. She's going to bring you a mic. I think it's working.
My question is for Dr. Morgan. You used the term Creole in a way I hadn't heard. Normally, I associate that term with Louisiana. You also used the term Creolization. Could you discuss your usage of the term?
Sure. Creole is, I'm using it not in the Louisiana sense, not in the Caribbean sense. But I'm using it in an 18th century sense, which is somebody or something that's native born, that's native to the region that we're talking about, the Americas, with foreign antecedents. So all it means simply is, you could describe it as Afro-Marylander, Black Marylander, but it could be a white Marylander too, or a white Virginian as well. So Creole just means native born in the society we're talking about, either Virginia or Maryland or Delaware if we're talking about Chesapeake, but it could be South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, it doesn't matter. Or it could be Jamaica, Barbados, Cuba, Brazil. People who are born native to that place and have foreign antecedents. And it can be white or black or a mixture thereof. So that's what I mean by Creole, and it's a fairly standard term that's used in the 18th century in the way that I'm using it. And creolization is just the process by which native-born peoples create cultures based on a mixture of all kinds of traditions and customs drawn from many different places.
Right. Which is probably the definition the way he just said that is probably a little clearer to what you've known it to be.
Yes, but I would say specific to an area.
Yeah. So I see everybody who's born in the Chesapeake, from George Washington to Charles Carroll to Fanny to William Lee. If they're born in this Chesapeake region, then they are Creoles. They may not have may not have recognized the term, many of them, but that's what they were.
And creolization would be?
Creolization is just the development of a native-born community and culture and society based on people who are native-born and generations of native-born.
And as for Louisiana, we know our friends in Louisiana like to claim stuff. Because, you know, they French and all that, you know. So I think you're right that there has been a localization of the idea of creolization, but it's used worldwide to refer to the phenomenon he's speaking to.
Maybe this will connect. Right, that's the value. Well, I was going to say maybe that connects to what the gentleman had asked earlier, that term Creole. But there's a wonderful study and a book about a woman by the name of Marie-Therese Coin, C-O-I-N-C-O-I-N. She was in Louisiana. She was born in Africa and brought into Louisiana, and she connected with a Frenchman in Louisiana. They had 10 children together, and then he had to get married so he could have a legal heir, and chose to marry a French woman. I bring her up because all of her kids are Creole, and Marie-Therese Coin was one of the biggest slaveholders in the southern part of the United States. An African-born black, because when they split, he gave her almost 20 acres per child.
Right.
And there are pictures that exist, and the plantation is still there. Some of it, of course, was washed away during the hurricane, but she built a jail on her plantation for any of her enslaved population members who got out of control. Rather than whip them, she would put them in an African-style jail. So if you look, but they talk about this idea of what it meant to be Creole and octoroon and quadroon, like all the steps removed within that Louisiana culture. That might also add some light.
I think there was another, I want to get it right. Okay, I know it was a little further up. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ruth Goldstein, and I'm from the Pikesville Library, Friends, and we were honored to be bumped by the president's panel.
I was going to speak there in the White House.
A fabulous honor. Anyway, I'm very grateful, I think we all are, that Hopkins took the initiative to start this conversation. And I'm wondering, I think you said that Owen House was demolished as recently as, did you say 2002? So what changed between 2002 and today? Because it sounds to me that there was hardly a ripple when that house was demolished, and that there might have been quite a bit of history involved with Owen House, and that there were slave quarters apparently attached, and you know, I understand that it was, you know, occupying a space,
Sure.
you know, that was important to Hopkins, but you know, sometimes buildings are preserved or even moved, or there's a lot of documentation, and it sounds like virtually none of that was even talked about or happened. So a lot has changed in just a few years.
Well, I know I arrived here in 1994, and I vaguely remember the Owen House. I mean, it's just kind of a vague memory at this point. But I do know, and this is something that we haven't said outright, but we've talked about, I think, among us in recent weeks, that it's often mistaken that slaves existed here after the founding of the university. And with that has come an idea that I remember the Owen House was sort of a marker of that, was believed to be a marker of that. Which is what I'm saying, that people have misunderstood that. But that the one thing I remember vaguely about that time when it got demolished is people raising, you know, again, conflating the information about that part of the campus.
So our Homewood staff, no one on campus understood what that building was until the absolute 11th hour. What was occurring was the new chemistry building is what was built, and it stood right there sort of in between Macaulay and the Hopkins Club. And a member of our Homewood Museum Advisory Board, architectural historian named Peter Perry, called me up and he said, "Hey, do you want to go check out Owen House?" I'd walked by it on campus multiple times. It was a clapboard building with Italianate lintels over all the windows. There was absolutely no reason from passing by to think that it was anything other than what it purported to be, which was basically like an 1850s farmhouse. So Judith Prophet, Peter Perry, and I went into the building, which had, at that point, it had been the writing center, it was an infirmary, it was a counseling center, a number of things like that. We decided to arrive with no appointment, because if we looked like we knew what we were doing, we're more likely to get sort of shut out. So we just, figured, oh, it's construction schedule. We'll show up for lunch around 11 o'clock. And we just walked in and was like, hey, you mind if we take a look around? I said no. And we're looking around. Everything kind of had drop ceilings. It had either the VCT tile floors or this kind of low loop pile, wall-to-wall carpet. Hardly any evidence of any historic detail. So there were two portions of the building. The front part, which Abby showed, she showed you pictures of both of them. So there's like 3-bay wide front part with a big Italianate hood over the doorway and flat Italianate bracket lintels over the windows. So this other part, which we believe was the double slave quarter, which I don't know if everybody understood what that means in terms of, you were saying, fireplace dividing it. It's basically a duplex. There's a central chimney stack, a fireplace open into the 2 rooms that are there. It's not that one family gets 2 rooms, so there's necessarily any pass-through between the 2. But it's a relatively standard building unit. There are restored ones at Hampton National Historic Site that you can see if you're interested in knowing more about this. But basically 2 squares, roughly 18 feet by 18 feet, with a shared chimney wall is kind of what it is. So when we walked between what was, from the outside, it looked like an 1850s farmhouse with this, what's called an L, a projection off the back. There was kind of a umbilical, like a link between those 2 parts. Opened the door, went to go down into the basement, and there were basically like 18-inch wide exterior clapboards with a bead struck along the bottom edge, which, by the 1850s, there's not lumber in those kind of dimensions. And so we kind of collectively gasped and were like, do you know what this means? Like, this is an 18th century building. So at any rate, I had a Carroll family descendant who had agreed to donate the cost of moving the building. For a long time, there was a stake on Decker Gardens where we'd staked out where the footprint would be. We had hoped to be able to do a controlled either deconstruction or move it, just buy some time to move it to another site. Anyway, so
I think
it was a different administration. It was under President Brody.
Right.
And so we did make an effort to save it. The Maryland Historical Trust came and sketched it and recorded it. Historic American Building Survey photographers came and photographed it. But the head of facilities kicked our team out, and I think
there's something in your response that's also clarified something. Earlier, I think we heard that the Owen house was on this property we're in right now.
Originally,
it was
very
but
original
where
location.
It came down was over by the Hopkins Club, right? It was.
Correct.
I remember now where it was. It wasn't on. It was down there. So visually,
so when we go back to maps, it looks like the footprint of the original farmhouse that Charles Carroll of Carrollton had hoped that his son would be content to renovate, but he was not. He built Homewood instead. That original location, we believe, was sort of at this end, on this foundation of Remsen Hall. The Wymans, we believe, are the ones who in the 1850s moved that building and took this frame slave quarter from another portion of, we have no idea where on the property. Here is too close to the big house. It was probably to, I don't know, to the northwest a little bit, sort of at the edge of woods and field or something like that. The Carrolls, I don't believe, would have wanted to be housing their slaves this close to the house. So we don't know why or exactly when, but there is this footprint of a building with an L off the back and a map from the mid to late 19th century, previous to Hopkins owning it, where it was moved to the location basically where the new chemistry building is. Pardon? Yes.
So however you did
they moved the frame farmhouse and the frame
slave
quarters and joined them together. So we did archaeology around, and we also, once it got into record and controlled demolition mode, we studied it as long as we could. So it was timber frame construction. There were craftsmen's initials scrawled in parging underneath the clapboards. There were rose-headed nails. There was no evidence. I mean, sometimes these slave quarters were earth-fast rather than on stone foundations. So it would have been pretty easily movable on like sledges drawn by mules or something like that. So, yeah.
That's too bad. That's very tragic.
Tragic, because here you have the mansion, and you could have I mean, you know, 10 years later, if you had the same sensibilities then as today, well, you know, life is not a dress rehearsal. So
well, the staff and board of the museum agrees wholeheartedly with you, and we really wish that we had the opportunity to show it to you today.
That we're having this conversation today.
I believe there was another...
Things that could be preserved in the future, who knows?
Excuse me. There were, I believe, was there someone here? And then I recognize you. Next.
I just want to say, in the title of the symposium, it said from Fells Point, and I don't remember anyone addressing the Fells Point aspect. I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
Yes, the question, I've been asked to repeat the question. The title of today's symposium includes Fells Point in the title, and the question is, what reference to Fells Point was made? Did we miss it? Did it not come up?
There was no talk specifically on Fells Point, but the idea was to put this whole thing within the context of the spectrum of freedom to servitude of African American experience in Baltimore. So that was not, and it did not end up being an extraordinary focus of anybody's talk. Phil Morgan touched upon these differences a little bit, but for more on that, I would also send you to Mary Ellen Hayward's essay in the Joshua Johnson catalog. Sorry, Mary Ellen, but...
Ma'am.
What I wanted to ask is, with all this knowledge of the Carroll family, is there any evidence that any Carroll emancipated a slave ever? And if not, how did they react toward emancipation? Is there any documentation of that?
Do we still have this computer hooked up?
I'll get that while you're talking.
I didn't. Just start talking. I want to pull the Habs photo up with the kids.
Okay. So Charles Carroll of Homewood wrote a will where he was going to emancipate his manservant and also give him $100. But that will was never executed, and William actually ended up being sent to Philadelphia with Harriet, so he remained a slave. As far as the other generations of Carrolls, I don't know exactly the answer to that. I think Catherine can maybe speak to that a little better than I can once she gets going.
We know that Charles Carroll of Duragan had an interest in the colonization movement. We know that Charles Carroll of Duragan, so the son of Charles Carroll of Homewood, had an interest in the colonization movement. We know on the other side of that equation, he also was responsible for selling some slaves south. We have not done a tremendous amount of research on that, but I think we've always hoped that there would be some Ph.D. candidate that really wanted to delve into those slave inventories, because I think, you know, as Abby showed in her talk, that there are these, you know, between a couple family letters and with these census records, we really can figure out an awful lot more about who these people were and where they lived. But nobody has seen records of who got sold, anybody who got emancipated. Somebody else talk for a minute, because I can't look this up. I want to show you. People who I suspect are not many generations beyond those who were enslaved in Duragan. In some 1930s Habs photos, there are children standing in doorways of these slave quarters if you zoom in, but I can't keep talking and find it, so somebody else either ask another question and I'll find it.
Aren't there some slaves who, on the Carroll properties, who are descended from Anne Joyce? And do you know that name, Anne Joyce? Mm-hmm. Who's the indentured English woman who gave birth to a number of mixed race, biracial kids? Possibly. And they claimed their freedom in those in some of those series of litigation suits in the
Yeah.
1780s and 90s, and some of those certainly became free. Whether on the Carroll properties, I think it's unclear.
Yeah.
But there were some Anne Joyce descended slaves on Carroll lands,
that's
right?
Mm-hmm.
I must apologize. I'm going to ask this gentleman to ask his question. I'm told that the people at the reception are either getting bored or angry. I'm not sure which. So yes, but we'll be more than happy to talk to you at the reception. Please, sir.
So my question had to deal with, there was, at the death of Charles Carroll of Homewood, some enslaved folks were removed to Howard County.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know what eventually became of those folks through census records, or, I mean, were they ever freed? Do we know anything of how their lives went after they left here?
Yeah. They appear in a later census of 1833. Some of the family members are listed, but not all of them. We know that a couple of them ended up going to Philadelphia with Harriet, but after that, I'm not sure what happened to them. As for the rest of them, they're actually only identified by their first names, and they have names like Ben, Sam, nothing really specific. The only reason we can identify the Connor family in that is because they list them all in the same order, and it's all the same names, and Isidod's a pretty unique name. So that's why we can identify that one family from that list, but the rest are all kind of hard to distinguish. Like you can guess about maybe their age based on the value that is assigned to them. Adult men are listed at $250. So some of the Connor children are listed as like $75 and $50. The infant, $50. So that's all we know about them. And it's almost impossible to then look at the slave population onto Oregon and pick out, which one is this Ben who was an adult in 1825. I mean, I guess it's possible, but seems improbable.
I'm sorry, ma'am. We're going to have to break again, but please feel free to interact with us at the reception. You were all fabulous. This has been fabulous. And I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Before you break, just 90 seconds, I wanted a response. I don't want it to be a personal response to challenge the assertion that in some speculative way we were determining some relationship with Charles Carroll Jr., which I'm not proud of, but it would only take me 90 seconds. And I don't want that left open. And I would appreciate doing it. It would only take 90 seconds.
Okay.
Thank you.
If you must, or if you'll help us begin the line, those of you who can quietly go ahead, we'll join you in a moment.
I think it's very clear, and you talk about Brother Dr. Kiefer Mitchell. He's a physician, and he asked me to come today so we could get the record straight. Charles Carrollton, first of all, was born, his parents didn't marry until he was 25 years of age, and was in France, and came back. The Carrolls were poor potato farmers from Ireland who came here. And Charles Carroll of Carrollton's father married Mrs. Brooke, who was a multi-millionaire landowner in Montgomery County. And that's where the slaves came from. And Charles Carroll Carrollton's father passed those slaves to him. And then Charles Carroll Carrollton was the oldest son of the Declaration of Independence, but also he was the longest living, in terms of active with young ladies and others in his plantation. Out of that union came Daniel Carroll, who was listed as a property owner of 3 acres of land in Howard County. You've got to remember, Anne Arundel County in 1850 split and became Howard County. And of course, Daniel Carroll, who is the product of this union of Charles Carroll Carrollton, then had a child, and his liaison was with Meriwether, Rachel Meriwether out of the Meriwether Post-Pavilion group. And then comes a Charles Henry Carroll out of that union between Daniel Carroll and Rachel Carroll. And that was Lily Mae Jackson's father, who was Charles Henry Carroll. And so it was my 3 greats grandfather. who was Charles Carroll Carrollton. And anyone like the definitive information, I'll be glad to provide it to you. We are about to open the Lily Mae Carroll Jackson Museum. And I think this is important to understand about America as a melting pot. And that we can't, and Charles, the Carrollton name, please let's disclose, he made that up. He wanted to be held as being an important person. So there was no such thing as Carrollton, and during his studies he came with the notion that I'll name myself Charles Carroll Carrollton. I think I made the 90 seconds. Thank you very much.